The Serpentine Subterfuge. Chapter 14. A week later, a Ravenclaw fourth year was found petrified in the owlery. Apparently she'd snuck out on her own to mail a letter, and a group of Hufflepuffs escorted to the owlery by Professor Sprout were reportedly quite emotionally scarred when they found her the next morning. Because of this incident, suspicion about the culprit swung strongly in favor of Slytherin House, who had thus far seen none of its own fall victim to the monster. Those who hadn't considered Rigel a viable suspect before seemed to be reconsidering, and the covert glances and not-so-subtle whispers picked up once more when she walked through the halls. Her friends stuck by her, but as they were mostly Slytherins as well, such confidence didn't lend her much credibility. The Weasley twins, displaying a nigh unlimited capacity for bracing humor in the face of grim ambience, had increased their efforts at lightening the atmosphere tenfold. It wasn't quite as bad as the now infamous pranking war of the year before, but there were several surprises in store for the castle's population each week, a good many of which Rigel was pulled in as a consultant on. She wasn't at a loss, then, when Fred caught up to her before defense class with another grand idea for complete mayhem. Rigel saw him coming, and handed her bag off to a solemn-faced Theo, who saluted her smartly before abandoning her to her friends. "Mercies, puppy," Fred said exuberantly, grabbing her arms and swinging her in a merry circle. "Just who I was looking for." He said that as if genuinely surprised to see her at the very place and time he sought her out. She tilted her head expectantly, but Fred just stared at her for a moment, seemingly waiting for something himself. "Yes," Rigel prompted. "I was waiting for you to ask where Fred was," Fred said, cocking his own head to the side with half a grin. "You're funny, Rigel. Most people automatically scan the room for my brother when I walk in." Rigel blinked, and said, bemusedly, "Okay, where's George?" Fred smiled brightly at her. "Very good, but you don't really have to ask. I just thought it odd that you didn't." Rigel made a small, meaningless noise to show she understood, but wasn't sure what Fred wanted her to say. "Anyway, I've got the outline for tomorrow's prank for you," Fred said, handing over a piece of paper. "You can read it in class, or, knowing you, after class. Let us know at dinner if it sounds okay." Rigel slipped the paper into her pocket. "All right. See you, Fred." The redhead waved at her as he trotted off down the corridor, leaving Rigel to wonder how he planned on getting to his class on time when he'd barely left her enough time to get to hers. She took her seat between Pansy and Draco, with a nod of thanks to Theo for depositing her bag on their table. Theo shrugged back, but smirked in a way that was universally understood in their house as, "You owe me." Dumbledore walked into the class a moment later and, as usual, began straight away. One thing they had learned in the last week was that Dumbledore's lessons were usually simple, engaging, and extremely efficient. He waved his wand in a gesture that was probably completely meaningless as far as actually affecting the spell he cast, and a quill on the teacher's desk stood at attention and began writing as Dumbledore looked about the room and named all the students present in quick succession. Once the attendance was taken, he smiled benignly at them all and said, "Today is a practical lesson. Please stand." They stood back from their tables, and with another very general wave of his wand the desks began neatly moving to the edges of the classroom one at a time, clearing a large space in the middle of the equally large classroom. Now that all four houses were in the same class, the defense classroom was less like a room and more like an auditorium in terms of size, though they all still sat at three-person tables. "Arrange yourself in a circle, please," Dumbledore said, with half a foot of space between each person. They all backed up to the edges of the room to form a large, somewhat circular shape. Rigel was on Draco's left, with Ernie Macmillan on her other side. "Take out your wands," Dumbledore said. The students took their wands out, and Rigel sheepishly made her way back over to her table, where her wand was safely stored inside her book bag. Several students snickered, including Ron, though he sent her a good-natured wink as she passed him. Draco had a long-suffering look on his face, and when she got back into her place, Macmillan said lowly, "What did you think he meant by practical, Black?" "We could have been running laps," Rigel shrugged. In truth, she'd forgotten her wand was in her book bag until she went to reach for it. She was working on not doing that as much, but usually she forgot she was supposed to be working on it, and just didn't. It slipped her mind in light of more important things, she supposed. "Ready, Mr. Black?" Dumbledore said serenely. Rigel apologized for holding up the class, and Dumbledore nodded his acceptance easily. "Now then." We will be practicing and refining the first of the 7 most common shields, the Protego shield. Since you learned it last year, the spell should come naturally enough that we can make our exercise more interesting. He conjured a large rubber ball from thin air, wordlessly and with nary a twitch of his wand, making several people gape with a resigned sort of awe. Whatever else could be said of the man, Dumbledore was an astonishingly talented wizard. The ball was twice the size of the quaffle, and just as red. Dumbledore floated the ball into the center of their circle, and took up a place next to Parvati Patil in the circle. Rigel glanced at Parvati briefly before focusing back on Dumbledore, but the girl had been avoiding her eyes since the incident in the hospital wing. When I start the ball, it will randomly target someone in our circle. That person is to erect a shield before the ball hits them, though it won't hurt if it does hit you. Once the ball hits either a person or a shield, it will switch targets and fly towards someone else. The ball could come at you at any time, so stay alert. It will be moving at the rate of a medium-powered curse, so if you are able to react in time to defend yourself, it is a good indicator of your reflexes and casting speed. Dumbledore raised his wand. Ready. Begin. With a flick of his wrist, the ball set off toward Ron Weasley, who shouted, "Protego," a half-second before the ball impacted with his shield. It bounced off lightly and sped toward Pansy, who brought up a shield calmly just in time to intercept the ball. It ricocheted in the direction of Hannah Abbott, who flinched slightly before blurting out, "Protego," and sending the ball flying at Theo. Theo called out the shield spell quickly, perhaps too quickly, as he was forced to hold the shield for a second or two until the ball reached him. The circle was just that large, with all 4 houses of their year around it. The ball bounced off toward Dumbledore himself, who cheerfully said, "Protego," and swirled his wand in a curlicue pattern. As if he needed to make it more obvious that he had no need of wand movements whatsoever. Rigel wondered if she'd ever be that good at spell work. Then she didn't have time to wonder, as the ball was headed straight for her. Rigel Draco hissed from beside her. Rigel raised her wand belatedly, and was about to say, "Protego," even as her heart dropped uncomfortably as she realized she wouldn't have time to get the shield in place because of her distraction, when her magic acted without her impetus. The shimmering red shield bloomed into the air before her, just big enough to block the ball's trajectory. The red ball hit the shield a second later, and vanished. It dissolved straight into the shield, as though the shield had consumed it without the slightest amount of effort. Rigel was so startled, not by the presence of the shield, but of its effect on the ball, that she dropped her wand with a clatter. Then, when the shield didn't move, she frowned and consciously asked her magic to stop, whatever it was doing. She could feel the energy recede back from her skin to its proper place in her magical core, but it did so weakly, and a quick internal scan showed her secondary layer to be noticeably thin. As she had noticed the previous times her magic used it, whatever that shield was, it took up a lot of power. She grimaced at the mildly freaked out looks on her classmates' faces. "I'm sorry, Professor," she said, "I didn't mean to do that." Dumbledore eyed her with mild speculation. "What an interesting way of practicing magic you have, Mr. Black. Do you know what shield it was you used?" Rigel shook her head slowly. "Not really. It seems to be an instinct of some kind, perhaps leftover accidental magic from my childhood. I don't understand it myself." Dumbledore inclined his head gravely, ignoring the skeptical and confused faces of most of the other students. "Magic will ever remain a mystery to most of us, I fear. In any case, I can see it was an honest mistake, and as any professor knows, every mistake is truly a lesson in disguise. So, who can tell me what shield that was?" The students exchanged glances, mostly blank, and Dumbledore said, "I'll give you a hint, it is one of the 7 common shields I've told you about. You are well versed with the first, and I have thus far demonstrated 2 of the others, so who would like to guess which of the remaining 4 this was, by observation of its effects alone?" Macmillan spoke up confidently from Rigel's left. "I'd imagine that was the Dipasco shield. It's the 6th shield you told us about. You said it eats anything that comes into contact with it, and is difficult to maintain. Judging by how there's no trace of the ball left, and Black over here is pale as a ghost, I'd say that must be it." Rigel had indeed felt herself blanch, though not from magic loss alone. She had been unknowingly casting the Dipasco shield for weeks. If what Dumbledore said about that shield was true, it was a stroke of pure luck she hadn't hurt either herself or someone else with it yet. The shield was dangerous to both the caster and his enemy, because it did not distinguish self from other. Most shields would allow their caster to penetrate them from the inside. This weakened the effect of the shield, but prevented casters from becoming trapped in their own shields. The depasco, Latin for something like to consume according to Theo, simply dissolved anything that touched it into particles too tiny to be perceived by the human eye. The advantage was that nothing short of spells on caliber with the unforgivables would be able to destroy the shield, and it was especially useful against physical threats. Unfortunately, that power was a double-edged sword. Many a wizard had accidentally dissolved their own wand tip by holding it too close to the inside of the shield, for instance. And she had used it against Selwyn. She'd have to apologize as soon as she returned to the common room, and then have a serious sit-down with her magic and explain why it couldn't use such a shield anymore. Someone could have been completely vaporized if they'd come into contact with the shimmering shield, and Rigel didn't know what medi-wizardry could do for someone who had been reduced to his constituent particles, but she had a feeling it was absolutely nothing. "Quite correct," Dumbledore said genially, 10 points to Hufflepuff. "Now, as useful as that shield is for stopping falling rubble, Mr. Black, this is perhaps not the best place for it. Care to try again?" "Of course," Sir Rigel said, bending down to pick her wand up off the ground. "My apologies for interrupting the lesson." "Knowledge gained is never something to be sorry for," Dumbledore said. He conjured another ball and sent it flying toward Rigel, who had plenty of time, now that she was paying attention, to ask her magic for a proper Protego shield before it hit. The lesson continued, most of their classmates having no trouble with the shield. Then Dumbledore said, "Let's make it more interesting, shall we?" He waved his wand and 2 more balls came into play, whizzing over and around one another as they rebounded around the circle. The balls no longer flew in straight lines, instead zigzagging and changing course with little notice, and the number of people who fumbled the spell increased. After 10 more minutes of practice, Dumbledore said, "Now that we're all warmed up, a friendly competition. From now on, if the ball hits you, step out of the circle. The last remaining person in the circle will win 10 points for their house." "However," Dumbledore said, his eyes twinkling, "there is a new rule. In this game, you are not allowed to shield yourself." They all exchanged confused looks. How were they to stop the ball? Their professor looked self-satisfied as he went on, "You are, however, allowed to shield your classmates. So the person who wins will be the person standing next to the best protector." Rigel wasn't sure what the purpose of the competition was, but she could tell there was some deeper meaning to it by the way the headmaster twinkled maddeningly at them. Was it some sort of test? There were a lot of people standing next to other people not in their own houses. If they only shielded those neighbors who belonged to their own house, would it be viewed as an indication of their character somehow? Dumbledore was always going on about house unity, so it was probably something of that nature. The other students seemed to share Rigel's confusion, and judging by a few faces her suspicion, but they agreed to the competition readily enough. Draco was looking determined, and Rigel was glad Pansy would have one fierce defender, at least. On Pansy's other side was Daphne Greengrass. Rigel wasn't too sure what to expect from Macmillan, herself. She had a feeling he was still highly suspicious of her for her presence at the Hufflepuff prefect's attack. She also wasn't sure Draco would be able to shield both she and Pansy for any truly feasible length of time if neither of their other neighbors helped. "There will be times when you need to erect a shield that is not directly in front of you," Dumbledore went on. "This will help you practice. I'll give you this tip as well, knowing when not to shield is equally as important as knowing when a shield is necessary." Rigel understood that well enough. If they tried to keep a shield around someone constantly, it would drain them of energy unnecessarily, and make it hard to keep up. Also, if 2 people shielded the same person at once, it would be a waste of energy. So they had to judge whether the person on their neighbor's other side would be raising a shield first, then decide whether their own shield was necessary. Hard to do in a few short seconds. On the other hand, he didn't say they couldn't cheat. "Pansy," Rigel said. Pansy leaned around from Draco's other side to say, "Yes. I'll take the first shield, you take the next, and we'll keep alternating every time Draco is targeted so we don't have to overlap," Rigel suggested. Pansy sent her a smile. "All right. I think your reserves are deeper than mine, though, so I'll probably be the first to give out." Rigel smiled slightly in reassurance. "Let me know if you get tired, then, and I'll take both rotations until you recover. Pansy nodded and resumed her ready position. Draco smirked, looks like I'm going to win. Macmillan scowled around Rigel at the blonde boy, how do you figure that? As long as I shield them, they shield me, Draco said, still grinning confidently. Rigel huffed in amusement, saying quietly, and now that you've said that, Macmillan and Greengrass won't worry about shielding us at all. Draco grimaced a bit sheepishly upon realizing he'd just ensured himself twice as much work. Rigel thought for a moment, noticing something else that Dumbledore hadn't specified. Switch places with me, Draco, she said. Draco blinked, then understanding dawned, good idea, right. Your stamina is the best, and it's points for Slytherin either way. He and Rigel swapped places so that Rigel was in between Pansy and Draco. A few of their classmates looked toward Dumbledore, but the headmaster did nothing more than twinkle at them, so several students quickly did their own swaps, trying to get next to people they could team up with. Dumbledore said nothing, but smiled a bit too widely as he conjured an additional 2 balls in the center of the circle. Now there were 5 in play, and they were moving slightly faster, as well. After that there wasn't much time to talk. Everyone concentrated on the balls, trying to keep their neighbors from being hit. She did notice Dumbledore step out of the circle, leaving Parvati next to Hannah Abbott, who in turn was next to Blaise Zabinai, with Greengrass still on Parvati's other side. Greengrass looked a bit put out at that, though surely she hadn't expected Dumbledore to shield Parvati the entire game so she wouldn't have to. It was a competition for the students, after all. Rigel kept herself peripherally aware of the balls going around the circle, the way she would maintain awareness of the bludgers during a Quidditch game while still concentrating on the other players. She noted that Theo was isolated between 2 Ravenclaws, probably because Blaise had moved to stand between Abbott and Ron for reasons known only to himself. Millicent was next to Davis, and both girls seemed to be shielding one another reliably, if a bit reluctantly. Probably putting their animosity aside for the sake of house pride, Rigel imagined. Crabbe was the first to get hit. Goyle hadn't been quick enough to protect him, and Terry Boot frankly hadn't bothered to try. Goyle in turn didn't attempt to shield Boot from any balls after that, which put a heavy strain on Boot's other neighbor, a Ravenclaw girl whose name Rigel wasn't sure of. Boot returned the favor, much to Lavender Brown's, who was on the other side of Goyle, dismay. Rigel shielded Pansy and Draco every time a ball came toward either one. This had the side effect of relieving Greengrass and Macmillan of half their work, but it was a small price to pay for her friend's guaranteed protection. Things began to get ugly after a few people had been hit due to intentional neglect, rather than accidental incompetence. Ron Weasley changed the game significantly when instead of only shielding, he shot a shield-breaking hex at Lavender Brown. Her shield, which was supposed to protect Goyle, shattered just before the ball whizzed by and smacked Goyle in the chest. Lavender's on our side. Parvati cried, scowling at Ron for a moment before going back to watching the balls. Goyle's not, Ron said shortly, and he's the one who got hit. Several people let out shouts about unfairness, but Ron only shrugged. The best defense is a good offense. Everyone knows that. So now it was a game of taking out members of opposing houses through sabotage as much as it was defending their neighbors. They learned quickly to put up shields at the very last possible moment, otherwise someone would send a hex to break it before the ball got there. Dumbledore said nothing, and Rigel supposed it was good practice for conserving energy when spellcasting in any case. As the game became more aggressive, people dropped out quicker. Most people kept shielding their immediate neighbors, even if they were from opposing houses, probably in case it was an ethics test Dumbledore had cooked up. Not many wanted to look like a bad guy. Anyone they didn't have to protect by implication in the game's parameters, however, was fair game for shield-breaking hexes. With 5 balls in play, there were times when both of someone's neighbors would be targeted at nearly the same time. Rigel twice had to ask her magic to perform shields in very quick succession to protect both Pansy and Draco from different balls, as neither Greengrass nor Macmillan had even made a pretense of shielding Draco or Pansy. Draco ignored Macmillan as well, but Pansy shielded Greengrass several times when Parvati didn't look like she'd get a shield up in time. The game went on, until it dwindled down to about a dozen players. Macmillan had finally gotten hit when the Hufflepuff on his left was distracted shielding the person on her left. Greengrass was still in, as were Parvati, Abbott, Blaise, Ron, Boot, Brown, and the Hufflepuff next to Draco. The Gryffindors invariably targeted the shields of anyone next to a Slytherin, which left them plenty of targets, since there were still 5 Slytherins in the game, but those remaining had gotten pretty skilled at delaying their casting until the last possible moment. It went on for another 5 minutes with no one getting hit, then Dumbledore added another ball. The circle was still very spread out, despite there being less people, because to close in meant having less time before a ball reached you, even though staying spread out meant a further distance for casting. Still, it was very crowded in the center with so many balls in play. Half the players were defending from a ball at any given time, and Rigel could see many of her classmates panting from the strain of doing the same charm so many times in a row. Rigel noticed the clock on the far wall of the large classroom, and pitched her voice over the sound of people shouting Protego and Patus, to say, "What happens if we run out of time, Professor?" Dumbledore clasped his hands as he thought about it. "I suppose I'd have to give everyone left 10 points. Everyone not in Slytherin House scowled at that, and the number of Patus attempts to crack the shields of those protecting Slytherins increased. A minute later, balls targeted both Boot and the Hufflepuff. Rigel didn't know very well at once. Ron and Brown both tried to shield Boot, Draco ignored the Hufflepuff, and the Badger let out a disappointed groan when the ball bumped into her and tagged her out. Then Blaze was targeted at the same time Abbott was. While he managed to shield her, Ron's shield over Blaze was disrupted by Parvati's shield-breaking hex, and Blaze was tagged. Next, Rigel was targeted at the same time Greengrass was. Pansy bit her lip, but it was her turn to shield Rigel, and there wasn't enough time between the balls to get 2 shields up in succession that time. Pansy turned her wand toward Rigel, looking a bit dismayed as she realized Parvati was busy shielding Abbott at the time, leaving Greengrass exposed. As Pansy pointed her wand at Rigel, Rigel wordlessly pointed her own toward Pansy, or rather, toward Pansy's right. Rigel's shield flashed into being in front of Greengrass just before the ball impacted the magic barrier lightly and bounced away again. At the same time, Rigel saw a ball coming at Draco from the corner of her eye. Without thinking, she threw up another shield in front of Draco with an abrupt gesture of her left hand, letting both shields fall a moment later to conserve energy for the next attack. Ron narrowed his eyes at Rigel from across the circle, a calculating gleam that Rigel didn't particularly like illuminating his gaze. Her next 3 shields were all met with attempts at shield breaking. She actually had to recast a shield around Pansy in a split second when the first shield failed. It seemed she'd become the major target of the students who didn't want Slytherin to pull ahead in points. She guessed it made sense, since she had protected all 3 of her remaining housemates. Really, though, Dumbledore never said they could only shield those next to them. If he was going to award house points, of course it made sense to protect all members of your own house. Greengrass stepped slowly sideways to close the gap between she and Pansy, probably figuring that if she was closer to the other Slytherins it would be easier for them to shield one another. Boot went down next, with Brown being eliminated right after him before Ron even realized he was now responsible for her as well. It was just Draco, Rigel, Pansy, Greengrass, Parvati, Abbott, and Ron left. They were now in the unique situation of having to defend both of their neighbors all the time, as balls targeted people one after another in succession too fast to keep up with. In the next 2 minutes, no one even attempted a shield-breaking hex, too focused on making shields as fast as they could. It might have been easier to just maintain a shield at that point, but none of them had a spare second to weigh the pros and cons. Rigel almost didn't notice when Draco fumbled for a split second while trying to shield her, almost. So caught up in the heat of the moment, spouting out shields left and right, she forgot they were in the middle of a game, or rather, her magic forgot. Red bloomed in the air before her, dissolving the oncoming ball in an instant, along with Draco's Protego charm, which he had managed to successfully cast in front of her at the last second. Rigel lowered her arm shakily from where it was shielding Greengrass once again, and stepped backwards out of the circle. She hadn't meant to use that shield on herself, but she was disqualified nevertheless. Dumbledore stepped forward and raised his wand at just that moment. All 6 balls stopped moving and the remaining 6 players all gasped for breath. "I think that's enough for today. Well done everyone. We have 5 minutes left, so I'd like you all to answer this. What have you learned today?" Dumbledore asked them that question at the end of every lesson. He said it wasn't enough to listen to an old man talk, if you weren't sure what you were listening to or what you should take from it. We learned how to work under pressure, Boots said, and how to trust our reflexes in a combat-like scenario. Yes, Dumbledore said, what else? We learned to adjust our timing in order to shield someone other than ourselves, in a situation where there were multiple threats and a small window of opportunity, Millicent said. We learned to think outside the box, Abbott said, glancing at Rigel, not to take the rules at face value. We learned to bend the rules in our favor, Ron said, and to think ahead. We learned which of our classmates play fair, Blaise said, voice tinted with a hint of amusement, and which of them don't care what anyone thinks of them, as long as they win. He eyed a few of their classmates, the ones who had done a lot more sabotaging and a lot less shielding when the game got tough. And which ones cheat? Macmillan snorted, glaring balefully at Rigel from where he stood amongst a group of Hufflepuffs. And which ones are sore losers? Theo smirked. So, Professor, about those points. Pansy admonished Theo gently, but Dumbledore chuckled good-humoredly, all in good time. What else have we learned? We learned not to get in the way of a Dipasco shield, Millicent said wryly. Always a useful thing to know, Dumbledore agreed. Now let me ask a different question, what if there were no points awarded at the end of the exercise? If the point of the exercise was simply to defend your neighbors from the ball, and no one won anything in the end, how would you have gone about it differently? Well, we wouldn't have been throwing around shield-breaking hexes, Brown said wryly. I mean, we'd focus on just shielding. What else? Dumbledore said, anyone? No. What about you, Mr. Black? You were closest to an ideal solution in the very beginning. Rigel thought for a moment. If we weren't competing, we would all work together, Rigel decided eventually. How so? Dumbledore asked mildly. If we were in a circle still, then everyone would just agree to shield the person on their right, Rigel said. That way no one would have to worry about more than one person, mix-ups wouldn't occur, and it would probably be wise to arrange a series of signals beforehand, in the event of problems like running out of energy, two balls attacking the same person, and things like that. Dumbledore stroked his beard thoughtfully. So if you had to sum up the key to success briefly in such a situation, what words would you use? Organization, Rigel said. Nothing else? Dumbledore pressed, raising his eyebrows. Isn't there another element that is important to your plan? Rigel stared at the headmaster blankly. What was she missing? Don't bother, Professor Draco spoke up, his voice surprisingly cool. Rigel doesn't know what you're talking about. Draco. Rigel turned toward her friend, a little confused. Draco leveled a look that was almost a glare at her. Rigel was taken aback. She didn't think she'd ever seen Draco that angry with her, not truly angry. He's talking about trust, Rigel. Trust. A plan like that won't work unless you trust the person to the left of you to cover your back. Rigel frowned, obviously that was implied. Trust them, Rigel, Draco gritted out, as in, not wasting time covering yourself and ruining the whole exercise because you don't think they are going to come through. Rigel paused. Oh. Draco, Rigel began. Don't Draco me, Rigel, Draco scowled, turning away from her slightly in a tangible dismissal. When you lie, I don't care, because I know you have your reasons, as ridiculous as they sometimes are. But this isn't about not trusting me with your secrets, this is you not trusting me to do something right that you'd already seen me do right. It's insulting, and it says a lot about your opinion of your friends. Rigel swallowed around a lump in her throat, not sure what to say. Dumbledore broke the awkward silence in the classroom with a small cough. Indeed, as Mr. Malfoy has pointed out, trust is an essential element of any plan. When you can't trust everyone around you to work for the greater good, achieving a goal is considerably more difficult, is it not? If you can only rely on yourself, you are at a disadvantage against those, like several of your Slytherin classmates, who put their differences aside to work together. Now, as I believe Mr. Knott pointed out, I have points to award. Let's see, we'll make it 30 points to Slytherin, 20 points to Gryffindor, and 10 points to Hufflepuff. Well done, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. They filed out of the classroom after collecting their things. Draco set off at a quicker pace than usual, leaving Rigel and Pansy behind as he made his way down the hall. Pansy looked torn between Draco's back and Rigel's lost expression. Noticing this, Rigel summoned up a rueful twist to her mouth, and said, "Catch up to him, will you, Pan?" If he'll listen, tell him I'm sorry. Pansy bit her lip and said softly, I don't think that's what he wants to hear right now, Rigel. The blonde girl picked up her pace and weaved gracefully among their classmates after Draco. Blaze sidled up alongside Rigel and said, he'll come around. You hurt his pride by insinuating that he was incompetent in front of all our classmates, and that after assigning him the very task you took from his hands. I didn't mean to, Rigel said a bit sharply, wishing Blaze didn't always feel the need to explain the world so bluntly. She frowned at the ground as they walked. My magic acts without my control when it thinks I'm in trouble. Well, don't tell Draco that, Blaze said, inspecting his fingernails. Hearing that you only subconsciously distrust him won't make him feel any better, and knowing that you feel unsafe while standing right next to him will probably make him feel worse. Great, Rigel said, an unfamiliar bite to the edge of her words. Now I know what not to say. Then you're halfway there, Blaze said, seemingly unaffected by her unfriendly tone. Rigel glanced over at Blaze's blank expression, then sighed, thank you, Blaze. I probably would have said something to that effect otherwise. Don't worry, I'm sure whatever you end up saying will be equally stupid, Blaze said nonchalantly, but that's part of your charm, Rigel. Draco won't hate you for putting your foot in your mouth, any more than you hate him for bringing his insecurities up in front of everyone like an idiot just because he was upset. I don't know if I feel better or worse after talking to you, Rigel said wryly. You don't really know much of anything, do you, Rigel? -0. HP. -0. The next morning Draco wasn't speaking to her, and Pansy was ignoring them both for being unreasonable boys, so there was no one to glance over her shoulder asking questions as she read the very thick letter she received from Archie. It came with a small package, which she set aside to open later. Plain black ink on the cover meant it was safe to open, so Rigel did, curious about what merited so many pages from her cousin, who, though he had a tendency to ramble, was usually too busy with his healer's studies to spare her more than general, if upbeat, platitudes. Dear Rigel. The most extraordinary thing happened the other day. Archie slipped through the classroom door just before it slammed shut behind him. Almost late for the third time this week, Mr. Potter, Professor Shoehorn remarked, not even bothering to turn away from the notes she was writing on the blackboard. Apologies, Professor, Archie said cheerfully, knowing Shoehorn wasn't really that upset with him. He shot Hermione a grin as he sat down. Thanks for saving me a seat, Mion. The brown-haired girl rolled her eyes at him perfunctorily. You sit there every day, Harry. I'm hardly staving off our classmates' greedy designs. Well then, thank you for sitting next to the seat I sit in every day, Archie said, still grinning. I guess you do like me after all. Hermione huffed and shuffled her papers embarrassedly. Someone has to make sure you still get the notes when you show up late. What if one day when you're a healer someone's life depends on something you missed? If one day someone's life depends on how well I can, he glanced up at the heading on the board, identify magical venoms. Oh, actually that does sound important. He scratched his head. Well, in any case I wasn't actually late. Almost late is not quite late, after all. In fact, back home we call that on time. Maybe. But it is one step closer to actually late, Hermione said in her best lecturing tone. Scraping by isn't only discouraged because teachers like you to try your best, you know. There's a such thing as leaving a margin of error. If something had gone wrong, you would have been late. It's called planning pessimistically. Archie smiled winningly at Hermione. I do that all the time. Like when getting a girl flowers, always better to get a round dozen than to hope she isn't disappointed by one. Hermione rolled her eyes. Who have you ever bought flowers for, your mom? With the ease of habit, Archie suppressed the expression that would otherwise have crossed his face when mothers were brought up. After all, Harry Potter had a mother, why should he be sad? He twirled a finger around Hermione's curly hair and said, I'd buy you flowers every day if you wanted, Mion. Hermione swatted his hand away briskly. He rubbed it with exaggerated forlornness, then said, girls are about the only situation where a positive margin of error is a good thing, though. Otherwise it's at best a waste, at worst ruinously detrimental. What do you mean? Hermione said, frowning. I mean, we can't do that in healing, can we? Archie said, when someone has a cold you don't drown them in pepper-up potion. Take these poisons we're learning about today. When making an antidote, you can't have too much or too little of any one thing. You have to get it just right. So really, I'm training myself to emulate perfection by being exactly on time every day. Hermione glowered at him, and when administering the antidote, will you give the patient exactly the amount you think they need to fight off the poison, or would you err on the side of caution and give a bit more in case you missed a pocket of venom somewhere? Archie pursed his lips. Well, if I was the hospital treasurer, I'd tell you to. Harry. Hermione said, exasperated. Archie laughed. All right, I guess we're both right, aren't we? You're both disruptive, that's for sure, Professor Shoehorn told them, brushing her hands of chalk dust and stepping away from the board. I don't suppose either of you has copied. She trailed off, raising her eyebrows at the autoquill on Archie's desk that was clearly just finishing a perfect copy of what was on the board. Hermione looked at the board in dismay, then scowled furiously when she saw Archie's quill. She scrambled for a fresh sheet of parchment and a bottle of ink, but Archie chuckled and shooed the autoquill away from his notes. He shifted the notes onto Hermione's desk and pulled out a new sheet of parchment. That one's for you, Hermione. Since I distracted you and all, I'll write my own. Hermione looked torn between wanting to copy the board herself, and not wanting to get behind in class. Everyone else had been copying it out as the professor wrote. After a moment of struggling, she sighed, I'll recopy them later tonight so I learn. Thank you, Harry. Hey, someone's got to make sure you don't miss anything. I mean, what if someday someone's life depended on it? Archie grinned unrepentantly as Hermione's hesitantly thankful expression dissolved into a fresh narrow-eyed glare. Oh, just be quiet. -0. AB. -0. After their diagnostics class, they had a 2-hour break for lunch. When they were third years, they'd be able to join the upperclassmen in going down to the nearby village for lunch, but for now they had to eat with the other students who were either too young or too lazy to get food outside of the mess hall. They could, however, take their food outside and eat it on the front lawn. Since it was early April, the weather was fairly cooperative. Archie and Hermione sat by themselves under a shady oak. Archie considered himself to be friends with everyone, but Hermione especially, and he didn't much mind that none of their classmates bothered the two of them very often. He had a feeling they were seen as a unit, Harry and Hermione, the two overachievers who had the best grades in every class. Unapproachable and uninterested in anything unrelated to learning more about healing. Archie didn't exactly agree with this assessment. He and Hermione did plenty of things besides study, and neither of them was exactly unfriendly toward others, but he also didn't see the need to correct their assumptions. He was happy just being especially good friends with Hermione, who really needed more than one friend at a time, anyway. There was something ironic in that, he, Archie, having only one serious friend at school, and Harry, as Rigel, having twice that many at least, but it was a fitting sort of irony, that supported their deception perfectly. Harry's parents were glad she had at least one friend, and Sirius saw nothing unusual in Archie being on good terms with many in his house. Hermione demanded he quiz her over the basic treatments for different organ failures, which they were being tested over next week in their general internal healing class. Brain failure, Archie said. Hermione froze for a moment, before scowling and swatting him on his arm. That doesn't count. The brain is an organ, Hermione, Archie said in his most patronizing tone. Hermione huffed, one which we haven't learned how to treat in the event that it fails, Harry. Still, you should know these things, Archie said loftily. So, if you had to guess, how would you treat brain failure? Like this, Hermione said, whapping him again, this time over the head. Dunce. You're so violent, Hermione, Archie said, waggling his eyebrows. I like it. She flushed to her roots and tossed her apple core at him. Archie caught it easily enough, inspecting it seriously. You missed a bite. He tossed it back. The apple a day only works if you eat the whole thing. Hermione bit off the last bit defiantly, looking like an angry chipmunk as she chewed pointedly and swallowed. Ask me another one. Archie laughed. Liver failure. Hermione perked up and answered with her usual attention to detail and thoroughness. And in the event that the patient has a history of substance abuse. Archie cut her off with a laugh. Now who's bringing up stuff we haven't learned yet? Hermione lifted her nose. It was in a footnote. A footnote in one of the books assigned for optional reading, Archie said, still laughing a bit, on next week's syllabus, no less. The fact that you know that means you read it too, Hermione shot back. Archie shrugged. So I did, But you set the covered-in class-only precedent in this study session when you refused to admit your ignorance about brain failure. No take-backs. You're such a child, Hermione sighed. Why would I want to be anything else? Archie shrugged, judging by the expression on Professor Talum's face, adulthood isn't all it's touted. He never looked so stressed before. The equivalent of several vats of polyjuice disappeared from under his nose last year, Hermione said mildly. The other professors still rib him about it at dinner, I hear. He never proved any was missing, Archie said casually. They couldn't properly account for them all, but of course it was quite a mess, hard to account for anything in those circumstances. You never told me what you were doing with it all, Hermione said. No, I guess I didn't, Archie said, twisting a finger in his ear indolently. Hermione groaned, come on, Harry. I've been so patient. Archie glanced over at her markedly impatient expression. Yes, I can see that. I have, Hermione insisted. I know you weren't using it, because I've been watching you almost a year and a half, and every day you go at least an hour between drinking anything. I don't know whether to be impressed or scared. But no one just does that for no reason, and I've been waiting for you to explain. Even though I said I was never going to. But I deserve to know. I did half the work, Hermione finished. Archie was frankly impressed she'd held herself back for so long. Unfortunately, as earnest as she obviously was, he had nothing to give her. You do deserve to know, but I can't tell you, Archie said, shrugging. I'm sorry, Mian, but you'll probably never know. Hermione narrowed her eyes dangerously. Never is a big word, Harry. Not as big as melodramatic, which you are being, Archie said, smiling softly. Really, I'd tell you if I could. Hermione sighed a bit. You know, I think you would, Harry. I think you would. If you ever can tell me, do. The moment it becomes possible, Archie assured her. Now enough of this sad no-can-do stuff. What would you do if your patient had a failing gallbladder? -0. AB. -0. Archie was walking back from his last class of the day, gym, which was down at the tracks. He was later than the rest of the guys in his class coming back, because as usual he had dithered in the locker room until they'd all gone before changing back into his regular school uniform. He was taking Harry's advice seriously. No one ever saw him naked. It wasn't much, but in the absence of conclusive proof, it might be enough to make a difference someday between caught and merely suspected. He took the long way back, as was his habit, around the greenhouses on the path that skirted the edge of the forest on the west side of the school. Aim was surrounded by forest on all sides, though the forest wasn't anything like the forbidden forest Harry wrote of. It was little more than a ring of forest, maybe half a mile across at its thickest. Its only purpose, as far as Archie could see, was as aesthetic concealment for the great stone wall that also surrounded the school. The wall was ridiculously tall, but the trees were still taller. Archie almost didn't hear the person slip out of the trees onto the path behind him, but whoever it was snapped a twig, probably intentionally, as Archie was of the opinion that no one in real life actually snapped twigs ominously when they snuck up on a person. Archie therefore wasn't terribly concerned as he turned around curiously and raised his eyebrows at the man who slipped out of the trees and onto the path. Hello. Do you know Harry Potter? The man asked. He had a rugged look about him. Tall, broad across the chest and shoulders, and nearly intimidating, because the grin on his face was nothing close to threatening. Archie scratched the back of his neck uncomfortably. Well, that's an interesting question. Who's asking? The man gave a jaunty bow, though there was something slightly insincere about it. I am, of course. I have a package for Harry. Archie made a non-committal sound of understanding. Any reason this package can't be mailed to Harry? The big man shrugged. Not particularly, only I've got a message to pass along as well. Archie raised an eyebrow. And this message is in a language that doesn't yet have a system of written denotation. The man laughed jovially. No, I dare say that's not the problem. The message is of a personal nature, that's all. Archie snorted. You look a bit old to have a personal message to deliver to a 12-year-old. You Harry's dad? The guy's face fell a bit. It's not like that. He'd have my head right proper for even thinking. Look, can you just tell me where to find Harry? I can't spend much time here. Archie considered the man carefully, wondering if he could pull this off. Finally, he decided he had no time to come up with a better plan. Well, I know it's been a while, but you're looking at me, Swift. It was a risk, but only a small one. Harry had described her friends from Diagon Alley on several occasions, and tall, brown-haired guy with an easy smile sounded like one Mayek swift knife. I assume the message is from Leo, and the package from Cray. With that, Archie had officially exhausted his knowledge of Harry's doings in Diagon Alley. Hopefully that would be enough to startle the man into believing him. The man blinked, then tilted his head confusedly. Harry. You're really Harry. You look so different. Taller, and, I don't know, different. I guess it has been a while, though. Why didn't you visit over the holiday? Leo said he stopped, frowning briefly. Wait, I saw you come out of the boys' side of the locker rooms earlier. Archie mentally grimaced. The man had been following him longer than he thought. Wait, didn't Harry's friends in the alley still think she was a boy? Of course, Archie said, feigning confusion. Why? What has Leo been telling you? Swift trailed off, and groaned. Well, I feel the fool. He laughed sheepishly. He made it sound so reasonable, that you might be a girl in disguise, or something, and how I should look for a skirt just in case. Archie laughed quietly, because Harry would never laugh loudly. Leo got you pretty good. How long did you spend looking for a girl version of me? Swift laughed as well. Suppose I should have known better than to believe anything the king says. Well, I'm sorry I didn't recognize you. I was looking for a skirt, but I should have known those eyes anywhere, I guess. Archie shrugged. It's okay. Leo hinted he might do something like this, so I admit I was having you on at first as well. Swift gave him a peculiar look, but smiled nonetheless. Yeah, I guess I walked right into it. Anyway, here's this, from Cray, like you guessed. He would have mailed it, but Leo wanted to send you a message anyway, so he volunteered me to deliver both the package and the letter personally. Is that so? Archie said distractedly, wondering at the implications of Lionel Hurst extending his interest in his cousin so far. Mayek went on thoughtfully. I think he worries about you a bit. He's used to having all his friends close, where he can keep an eye on them. I guess with you all the way out here, he just wanted an excuse to check up on you. Archie's face didn't betray one iota of the unease he felt at hearing that. What was Harry doing, making such heavy-handed friends? He took out a small packet and 2 letters, handing them to Archie and then tucking his hands into his pockets. So you'll be around this summer, won't you? I know you were real busy over the holidays. Even His Highness only saw you once or twice, I gather. Rispar asks after you sometimes. Please give my best wishes to the lady, Archie said, a bit uncomfortable with the conversation moving back into personal waters. I'll be around, of course, but this summer I've got an internship at the Potions Guild. Oh, yeah, His Highness mentioned that. Will it take up much of your time, then? Swift asked. I'm not sure yet, but it's supposed to be rather intensive, Archie said. Listen, it was great to see you, Swift. I've got to get back for dinner, though. Give everyone my best, except Leo. Just give the king whatever you think he deserves. Swift grinned broadly. Sure thing, lad. I'll be off, then. Stay well. Mayek disappeared into the trees. Archie wasn't sure how he was going to get back over the school wall, but he frankly had bigger things to worry about, like how Harry was going to explain things to Leo when his man reported that Harry Potter was very much a boy. -0. HP. -0. Isn't that interesting? I never imagined my friends from London would go to so much trouble to look me up here. I guess I've made an impression on them. What do you think about my little joke with Mayek? I love to keep people guessing. Let me know how things are going on your end, and stay away from giant snakes. For Merlin's sake, Rigel. Best. Harry. Rigel folded the letter slowly and tucked it into her school bag. There were 2 other letters within Archie's letter, one from Leo and one from Cray. Cray's explained that the small package contained several rolls of new recipes he'd managed to get hold of, with requests from Burke to send off a sample of each new recipe she completed when she had the time, in case they inspired him to expand his order in the future. She opened the letter from Leo and scanned it, but it was the usual questions: how AIM was going, how her healing studies were going, was Cray working her too hard, etc. There was nothing in the letter that indicated why Leo would do something so blatantly antagonistic. Archie was worried about Leo finding out that Harry Potter was a boy at school, and thinking it odd, but Rigel knew better. Leo had told her that he already knew she pretended to be a boy at AIM, because he'd sent someone to ask around about her before. The real question was why Leo would send Mayek looking for a girl, when he knew very well Mayek wouldn't find one. Was he deliberately trying to make things difficult for her? She knew he disapproved of her continued deception, but would he really try to deliberately sabotage it? She thought carefully about how to approach this new development throughout classes that day, but that evening when she sat down to write her letter she still wasn't quite sure what to say. Eventually, she decided to approach Leo with a question, instead of a flat-out accusation. Dear Leo. Good to hear from you. Tell me, did you send Mayek here in an intentional plot to reveal all of my secrets, or was that accidental? I'm not as upset as I am confused, though Mayek might be both when you next see him. I may have intimated that you played a rather ingenious joke on him, but you'll talk your way out of it. I'm sure you enjoy surprises as much as I do, after all. In the interest of facilitating consistency between the two of us, however, I'd like to know this. You know already that here at AIM I am as much myself as I was when you first met me. Why, then, did you send Mayek armed with the truth when it would do him no good? I sincerely hope you have a reason beyond simply scaring the magic out of me. Tell the next person you send with a letter to look for pants, and give my best to everyone, again. Harry. -0. HP. End of part 1. She had another session with Snape that night, lending her magic to imbuing the potion he was researching. When she appeared in Lab 1, however, Snape took one look at her and gave an irritated snort. What is wrong, Mr. Black? He asked, turning to the table of supplies and efficiently taking apart the stratifying apparatus before storing it in its case. Rigel took a moment to make sure her face betrayed none of her emotions, wondering how Snape had concluded she was upset so quickly, then shook her head in feigned confusion. Nothing, sir. I look forward to continuing tonight. For someone who lies so often, Mr. Black, you are not exceedingly skilled in the art, Snape said coolly, not looking at her as he carried the unused silver cauldron across the room and locked it up securely in one of his many cabinets. My problems are not impressive enough to need airing, Professor Rigel said, her voice as polite as she could make it while refusing to answer his question. Only impressive enough to have you moping over them, then. Snape's sarcasm was on form tonight, Rigel thought. I'm not sure moping is the word I'd. Does this unimpressive problem have to do with the reason Mr. Malfoy is currently not speaking to you? Snape asked with studied disinterest. Rigel suppressed the flinch she knew Snape was looking for, and said, I wouldn't presume to know Draco's motivations for anything, sir. Snape paused in his clearing away of materials to scowl at her. I suppose you also wouldn't presume to hazard a guess as to why Mr. Malfoy spent 2 hours sulking in my office yesterday evening. Did you ask him, sir? Rigel tried. Apparently he did not feel that the problem could be adequately explained in words. Snape said, he was content to wallow silently in his misery, a heretofore unprecedented occurrence, I can assure you. Perhaps the problem is rather personal, Rigel said. Or perhaps he feels that to discuss it would be a betrayal of someone else's confidences, Snape said flatly. Rigel considered this. I wouldn't think it to be. At Snape's unamused look, she allowed, though perhaps Draco is of a different mind. Enough sidestepping the issue, Mr. Black, Snape said sharply. If there is a problem in my house, I expect it to be dealt with. We will, sir, we just need a bit of. I have seen no evidence of this thus far, Snape interrupted. In fact, your current solution seems to involve the both of you avoiding one another as much as you avoid the subject. Explain. Now. Rigel suppressed a resigned sigh. Yes, sir. Draco is angry with me, because I did something that seemed in his eyes a fundamental betrayal of trust. Snape's face was very blank, and Rigel wondered if he wasn't holding himself back from making an ugly accusation. At the slight pang of hurt in her stomach, she reminded herself that Snape had no reason to trust the son of his childhood rival, and every reason to worry about Draco, his own godson. And is he mistaken in his assessment? The potion's master asked evenly. Rigel hesitated, long enough that Snape's eyes flashed dangerously. She swallowed carefully. He is not entirely wrong, sir, but he is also oversimplifying the situation. Pray tell, Snape said, voice tight. You know that sometimes my magic does things without my direction, Rigel began. Snape's eyebrows snapped up. I was under the impression that this phenomenon largely dissipated with the acquisition of a properly matched wand. Rigel inclined her head. It did, for the most part. With my wand, I can control my magic very easily. It finally does what I tell it to, when I tell it to. However, it still at times does things I don't tell it to do. If I consciously try and make it not do something, it always listens eventually, but I can't be consciously telling it not to do anything all the time, so it's hard to predict when I need to exert control. Snape stared at her for a moment. Usually when a child gains control over his magic, incidents of accidental magic dissipate as a consequence. I do not believe it common for a wand to merely facilitate a wizard's control in addition to continued bouts of accidental magic. Rigel was suddenly struck by what a silly term accidental magic really was. It wasn't as if magic randomly, accidentally spilled out from a child and affected the world in purposeless ways. Magic always acted for a reason, in her experience. Most of my accidental magic stopped, Rigel said thoughtfully. I mean, my magic doesn't change spells I'm actively trying to cast anymore. It's just that it also casts spells on its own, sometimes. Magic does not cast its own spells, Snape said. Accidental magic isn't ordered magic like a spell is. It merely reacts in a naturalistic way to a child's subconscious emotions. It becomes a general force manifesting the child's will, not anything as specific as a spell. That's why the most common form of accidental magic is some sort of physical change to the world around a child. An object moved from one place to the next, an object altered or transformed into something else, broken things becoming whole, whole things becoming broken. It's all basic changes of states, untailored to a specific result or to a specific kind of object as spells are. Rigel frowned. That's not what my magic is doing, then. Snape frowned back. Yes, it is. Last year you slowed Mr. Longbottom's descent from a fall, did you not? Your magic created a physical force to protect you from Mr. Jordan. These are classic, if extreme examples of accidental manifestation of magic. But that's not all, Rigel said, confused. It used to be that when I cast a transfiguration on something it would come out completely different, not just changing the state of the object, like setting it on fire or vanishing it or something. I tried to change a spice shaker into a rock once, and my magic turned it into a postcard, with an inscription and everything. That sounds specific enough to be a spell, doesn't it? Snape considered this. You say that sort of thing stopped when you got your wand, though. That is a rather unusual transfiguration, but it still may have been accidental. Rigel interrupted with a frustrated head shake. You just said accidental magic responds to a child's will. I wanted Neville to stop falling, and I wanted Jordan to back off, but I've never had a fierce, unconscious desire for a postcard, as far as I know. It didn't have a purpose, it was just my magic being cheeky. There's more, too. My magic has stopped changing things while I actively try for a specific result, but it still casts its own spells, real spells, ones I haven't learned yet. Impossible, Snape scowled. You must have forgotten you know the spells. Perhaps you have an affinity for wandless magic, and didn't realize you were willing the spells to be cast. Rigel pressed her lips together with frustration. I didn't know what the Dipasco shield was until Dumbledore taught it to our class, but my magic used it weeks ago, to shield me from flying rubble. Snape's face lost what little color he had. That shield is extremely dangerous. Are you sure that's what manifested? Rigel nodded. Yes. It was red, dissolved things on contact, and took an extremely heavy toll on my magical core. Snape seemed to be thinking fast. Perhaps, sometimes a child's magic is able to reproduce a spell that has been cast around him significantly often. The child's magic copies the signature of a spell if it is cast in proximity often enough. There have been cases, but it is exceedingly rare that a spell will be cast often enough for a child's magic to carry the imprint of it. At most, it may give the child an affinity for certain kinds of spells later on, though that is unproven research, and goes deep into arguments about light and dark affinities, and how a child's magical core responds to outside influence while developing. At any rate, this is concerning news, Mr. Black. That sort of spell manifesting without your control could seriously injure your fellow students. I know, Sir Rigel said, it hasn't hurt anyone so far, but I'm not sure how far my influence over my magic extends. Even if unconsciously I don't want my magic to hurt anyone, Fear or surprise might override that concern on a basic level, in which case my magic may lash out. She felt equal parts nervous and relieved to be telling Snape this. It was unnerving to report such a weakness to someone with so much control over her life, but maybe he could fix it, the way he'd known what to do when her wand wouldn't work. Snape took a considering breath. At this point, I am not sure how to proceed. That a Desparco shield could be cast at any time in a school of adolescents is worrying. I could arrange for a magical dampener for you, but you would have to remove it during lessons in order to practice, thereby negating the purpose of having it for a large portion of your day, and sometimes when a developing core is dampened for too long the child's magic ends up even more out of his control when it is taken off, because by relying on it he doesn't practice controlling it on a subconscious level as other children do. On the other hand, if it is truly beyond your control already. I'm not sure it's beyond my control, Rigel said fairly. When I ask it to do something, it always does, and the same when I expressly forbid it to do something. It's just that I can't know all the possibly dangerous things it might try to do until it does them. Now that I know what the Desparco is, I'm sure my magic will stop using it. It's the unknown I'm worried about. Snape rubbed his temple. That does not make any sense. Your magic cannot know spells you yourself do not know. That spell had to have been cast around you before, for your magic to emulate it instinctively. But you said yourself the spell is dangerous to cast around children, who would have done so around me, at an age that I was too young to remember. Rigel pointed out. Who indeed, Snape said darkly. Rigel didn't like the look on his face, the bitter, slightly contemptuous look of a man who thought the answer was obvious, but knew better than to think his audience would agree or even entertain the idea. It made her think he suspected someone from her family, like Sirius, or James. Rigel knew better, though. Her father and uncle would never be that irresponsible. Not around their own family members. Maybe the Desparco was a fluke, then Rigel said, most of the time, my magic does seem to act within the usual parameters of accidental magic. I'll work harder on controlling it, sir. I'll talk to my magic, and see if. Will you kindly stop referring to your own magic as some kind of proto-sentient being separate from yourself? Snape snapped, this is part of the problem, I think. You see your magic as something other than part of you, something you have no right to control, and so of course the magic is uncontrollable. Rigel blinked, but if it can respond to my own views of it and react accordingly, doesn't that prove that it is semi-sentient at least? No, Mr. Black, Snape said, exasperated, your magic responds to your will because it is a part of you. If you believe it to be unwieldy, it will become unwieldy because you made it so. You are controlling it, whether you realize it or not, by having beliefs about it and acting on them. Magic reacts to will naturally, Mr. Black. It is not an indication that your magic is somehow different than every other wizard's magic. You must cease this naive tendency of thought, or it is only going to get worse. Rigel could tell that Snape didn't want to hear any disagreement, so she kept silent, but she couldn't help but think that she'd begun regarding her magic as out of control after it had proved itself to be, not the other way around. Snape released a long breath, which in a less controlled man would have been called a sigh. We have wandered from the point. What does this have to do with Mr. Malfoy's ire? Rigel recalled the beginning of the conversation, and grimaced. It was in Professor Dumbledore's class. We did an exercise in which I was supposed to shield Draco and he was supposed to shield me, but at one point my magic, without my conscious instruction, shielded me when it looked like Draco wasn't going to get his shield up in time. Snape's lips twisted wryly. I might have supposed the problem involved a slight to Draco's not insignificant ego. Rigel was tempted to defend her friend, but Snape didn't sound as though he meant anything terribly insulting by it. From the way he'd slipped and called him Draco, she rather thought he was fond of his godchild's somewhat petulant pride. Come to think of it, Rigel was a bit fond of it herself, which was probably why she humored it so often. Sir, she said, tentatively, this may be out of line, but is there anything you think I could do to make Draco not mad at me faster? Snape sneered slightly. If you knew how foolhardy it was to ask me, of all people, the best method for keeping friends. He snorted, but relented. Draco doesn't respond well to apologies. His father has taught him that if someone is truly sorry, they will change how they act. You would do well to make overt, meaningful changes to how you deal with him. And an offering of strawberry tarts would not go awry, he added sardonically. Rigel nodded slowly. Thank you, sir. Now get out of my lab, Snape said. You have wasted enough of my time with your schoolyard troubles. Rigel wisely didn't point out that he had demanded she do just that. She inclined her head respectfully, and turned to go. And Mr. Black, Snape added sternly. She turned to face him again. Control your magic. Yes, sir, she said. If only it were so simple. -0. HP. -0. Rigel headed back to the common room, planning to fill the extra hours that evening with Archie's healing textbooks. From the sound of his letter, she had fallen slightly behind that semester. As she entered the common room, Selwyn barked at her from a table nearby. Black. Where's your escort? Rigel paused. Professor Snape let me go early, so I hadn't arranged one until later this evening. Selwyn narrowed kohl-rimmed eyes dangerously. And you didn't think to ask Professor Snape to patron call another prefect, or walk you back himself? Rigel shook her head slowly. No, I didn't think of it. I'm sorry. You always are, Selwyn scoffed. Just don't ask me to feign surprise when the basilisk gets you. That's a bit harsh. Alice Rosier spoke up from where Rookwood was proofreading his essay. At least he had an escort to begin with. Selwyn shot Rosier an unimpressed look. It's not enough to only sometimes think about being cautious. Caution is only effective if it's applied consistently. It's just difficult to take every eventuality into consideration from the start, Rigel said weakly. If you're a Gryffindor, I'm sure it is, Selwyn said, but you aren't a Gryffindor, Black. You're a snake. Snakes have to look after their own skin. You've got a lot of people looking out for yours right now, but don't expect it to last if you can't demonstrate a basic concern for your own well-being. If you don't care about your safety, others will wonder why they should bother. I do care about my safety, Rigel said. I don't rush around looking for trouble, or anything. I just have a lot on my mind, so sometimes I forget. You can't just forget, Black. That's what I'm saying, Selwyn said. Whatever else is filling up that brain inside your thick skull, it's not as important as survival. Where's your wand? My wand. Rigel blinked at the abrupt change in subject. Yes, Black, your wand, Selwyn snapped. That thing that can only save your life if you have it. Rigel patted her robes, and produced it rather triumphantly from the third pocket she checked. Here. Selwyn's jaw was clenched, and even Rookwood looked to be fighting a grimace when Rigel glanced at him. She looked back at Selwyn as the head girl said, if you have to look for it, you're already 3 steps closer to disaster. Pick a pocket right now, and from now on always keep your wand in that pocket, nowhere else. I'll be checking you randomly for the next month, and every time your wand isn't in that pocket, I'm docking 5 points from Slytherin. Rigel's ears burned, but she obediently stowed her wand in the right side pocket closest to her waist. Yes, head girl Selwyn. Don't act all stiff and offended, Black. It's for your own good, Selwyn said. Danger doesn't come when you're waiting for it, no matter what the lions think. It comes in the dark, it comes from behind you, it comes from places you'd never expect, and it comes when you think nothing is wrong. Rigel nodded politely, fighting a grimace when it seemed that Selwyn wasn't close to being finished. The older girl opened her mouth to continue, but Rosier interrupted hastily. Thank you, Alice, he said, standing gracefully from his seat and clapping the head girl's shoulder bracingly. I'm sure Rigel understands your meaning perfectly. He won't forget anymore, will you, Rigel? Rigel shook her head solemnly. Rosier stepped between she and Selwyn, prattling on reassuringly to Selwyn while gesturing subtly with a hand behind his back for Rigel to make a quick exit. Rigel nodded politely to Rookwood, who was now pointedly perusing a textbook on avian anatomy, and began edging backwards slowly. Rosier stepped backwards as well, slinging an arm around her shoulder and saying, I'll help Rigel practice stowing his wand right now. In fact. One table over, several people dissolved into poorly disguised snorts of laughter. Not like that, Rosier sighed. Cesspools, the minds of today's adolescents. Selwyn flicked her hair over her shoulder dismissively, turning back to her homework. Just get him out of my sight, Alden. Rosier steered Rigel swiftly across the common room, arm still around her neck. Rigel allowed it for a moment, but when he started heading for a couch she ducked sideways to free herself. I was going to study. Go get your books, then Rosier said, waving her off and taking a seat casually on the couch. I'll wait. I was going to study by myself. What difference does it make? I won't bother you. I want to see what you're studying, that's all, Rosier said calmly. Rigel hesitated. It's not anything interesting. Rosier leveled a flat look at her. Go get your books, Rigel, and let me decide what I think is interesting. Rigel sighed, but could not think of anything to say to that. She turned and headed for her dorm room, trying not to glance toward the cluster of low-backed couches and chairs where her friends usually sat. She was sure Draco would be sitting there with Pansy, Blaze, Theo, and Millicent, working out a transfiguration problem or maybe even writing his potions essay without her help for once. A small, pathetic part of her worried that he'd get something wrong without her there to proofread it, which was ridiculous, because Draco was actually quite skilled in potions, and Blaze was always happy to fact-check an essay. If she had checked the corner, however, she might have been better prepared when she opened the door to find her second-year friends sprawled about the dorm. They looked up when she walked in, and there was a moment of awkward silence after everyone except Draco greeted her politely. Pansy stood up quickly from where she'd been sitting primly on the end of Rigel's bed. Sorry, Rigel, I've spread my things all over. Rigel smiled as she crossed the room to the foot of her bed, though her face felt a bit stiff doing it. It's all right, Pansy, you can stay there. I'm just grabbing a book from my trunk. Where are you going now, I wonder, when the library group has already left? Draco drawled from his own bed without looking away from the star chart he was labeling. Just to the common room, Rigel said softly as she picked out the book she was looking for and closed her trunk gently. Oh, good idea, Draco said with heavy sarcasm, much quieter out there, I'm sure. Rosier asked me to. Draco whipped his head around to glare at her. Did he? Imagine that. What a good friend you must seem to him, Rigel, so accommodating, so persistently genial. Just imagine if he knew how you really felt. Draco, Rigel said, frowning slightly as she straightened from her crouched position by her trunk. It's not like. Is the idea of telling the truth so utterly foreign to you? Can you not even comprehend how much less work your life would be if you just told people up front that you had no intention of making any genuine attempt at friendship, and in fact are entirely incapable of such a thing? Draco asked, voice loaded with fake concern. Imagine it. You could go out into the common room right now and tell Rosier that you don't appreciate his intentions. You could tell him that he's being overbearing, and inconsiderate, and you're frankly not interested in whatever he's trying to do. But you won't do that, will you? Because you think pretending nothing is wrong is the same thing as solving the problem. Rigel stared at Draco, unwilling to say something equally scathing back, but also unable to reasonably refute his point. From Draco's point of view, it probably did look a lot like he described it. Draco, you're being unfair, Millicent said quietly from where she was sitting next to Blaze. Rigel's too polite to be so blunt when it could potentially hurt someone's feelings. Rosier is his friend, too. Of course he doesn't want to upset him. Draco tossed his hair and sniffed, going back to his star charts with an air of unconcern. That would almost be noble, if it were true. But it isn't true, and Rigel knows that. He isn't going along with Rosier to spare his feelings. He's doing it because he wants people to like him, and he thinks the only way to do that is to appear to give them what they want all the time. Except he can't actually bring himself to be so selfless, so deep down he resents them for asking. Instead of just saying no, the worst part is, people like you applaud him for it, because you can't fathom how deeply passive-aggressive he really is. Rigel took a slow breath. You're wrong, Draco. She walked back toward the door and opened it. Draco scoffed, a small, bitter noise that was less offensive than it was depressing. Am I? How so? Rigel's fingers clenched on the doorknob as she answered, without turning around. That's not the worst part. She let the door close softly behind her, and trudged out to where Rosier was still lounging indolently on a couch. First Draco, then Archie's letter, then Snape not letting her work, then Draco again. She felt worn out and stretched thin, like the bottom of a cauldron that had had too many heavily acidic poisons brewed in it. She sank down on the couch beside Rosier and opened her book. The words blurred together, and it wasn't until the first teardrop hit the page that she realized the blurriness was from her eyes welling up. She huffed a little at her own patheticness, and set the book aside, bringing her knees to her face to subtly stanch the slow flow of liquid escaping her eyelashes. With her arms wrapped around her knees and the sound of her own deep breathing filling her ears, she could almost pretend she was by herself, at home in her lab, before she had ever thought about going to Hogwarts. Before all the lies, before friends and all their complications. Then again, she thought fairly, not being quite pathetic enough to allow herself false self-pity yet, was there really a time before all the lies? Before deciding to trick her way into Hogwarts, was she really so honest and pure? How many times as a child had she assured her mother she was wearing safety equipment, when really she had foregone the clumsy, cumbersome gloves and fireproof outer coverings in order to improve her knife technique? She had started masking the outside of her potions manuals with covers from history books by the time she was 8, so that her father didn't accidentally throw them away. She distinctly remembered telling her mother that she loved the beginner's potions kit she'd been given for her 10th birthday, even though she had mail-ordered herself the same kit a couple of years earlier, and had very specifically asked for the newest compendium of poison antidotes that year. Maybe Draco was right, and she was incapable of telling the truth. What's so great about the truth? She thought bitterly, all it does is upset people. Lying upsets people too, another part of her brain pointed out. Draco wants me to tell the truth. Only because he hasn't actually heard it, she argued with herself. If he knew the whole truth, he'd hate me. He already hates me. And wasn't that a depressing thought? A hand on her shoulder interrupted her mental pity party. Rigel shifted her knees slightly to rub the last of the water from her eyes, and lifted her head. Yes, Rosier. Are you all right? Rosier asked, retracting his hand once she'd uncurled. Yes, Rigel said, thank you. Rosier quirked a small smile at her. You're lying. Rigel snapped, if I'm such a liar, why bother asking me anything? Rosier raised one eyebrow and lifted his hands in calm surrender. My apologies for whatever nerve I just touched, but you should know that I meant my accusation fondly. Really, I don't mind when you lie. It's almost endearing. Rigel blew out a breath and shook her head sharply. Don't apologize, Rosier. I'm sorry. You were right, anyway, I'm not really fine right now. I know, Rosier said after a moment. It was obvious you weren't, I shouldn't even have asked. Rigel grimaced and rubbed at her eyes impatiently with the back of her fists. They felt raw, and slightly itchy. Don't do that, Rosier said, pulling her hands away from her face. When it looked like he was going to hold on to them, Rigel retracted them smoothly to run through her hair, as though fixing it. Rosier let her, though his eyes taunted her silently as she gave up on her hair and busied her hands with picking up her abandoned healing textbook and finding the page she left off on. When she had stared at the page, unseeing, for longer than would have been credible were she actually reading it, Rosier gently took the book away from her and set it on the end table behind him. Rigel let him, mostly because she felt too tired to even pretend to study at that point. Do you want to talk about it? Rosier asked. No, Rigel said. Fair enough, Rosier said. He studied her for a moment, then said, turn around. Rigel eyed the upperclassman, but didn't move. What? Turn, he said again, motioning with his finger for her to present her back to him. I'll do your hair. Again with the hair, she said ungraciously, it's too short to do anything to. Maybe you should grow it out, then Rosier suggested innocently. Maybe you should leave it alone, Rigel suggested, not so innocently. It will help you relax, Rosier said. It's going to stress me out, Rigel argued. Why would it stress you out? Rosier asked. I don't know, but it will, Rigel said, frowning. Can't I just sit here quietly for a little while? You can go, if you're bored. Rosier blinked golden eyes at her. You mean can you sit here feeling miserable and alone, overthinking whatever problem is going on between you and Draco right now and desperately trying to figure out what you can do to fix it? Well, you could, but do you really think that's not going to make you stressed? Rigel pressed her lips together stubbornly. Does Draco know you call him by his first name? Rivals should be friendly with one another, shouldn't they? Rosier said, grinning. Rigel tilted her head. Since when are you rivals? The upperclassman shook his head. Never you mind. Just turn around and let yourself relax for once. I'd rather not, Rigel said bluntly. Maybe if she was as honest as Draco told her to be, Rosier would back off. Think of it as a trust exercise, Rosier said. Why should I trust you? Rigel asked flatly. Rosier blinked his honey-colored eyes at her. It's like you're trying to insult me. It's like you're trying to guilt me into something, Rigel returned. You say that like it isn't working, Rosier smirked. Right. So far it was, honesty equals 0, Rosier equals 1. Rigel scowled, if we both know you're trying to manipulate me into doing whatever you're trying to get me to do, then why should I let you do it? Rosier considered this for a moment. Deep down, you want to be friends with me, Rigel. You want to call me by my first name, and you want to be yourself around me. I don't say this to be egotistical, I believe you want this with most people. I think there's a part of you, a soft, buried part, that genuinely wants to be close to other people. Rigel wasn't sure what to say to that, so she settled for staring incredulously. There's another part of you, however, that is scared, Rosier went on, as though he were her personal mind healer. That's the part that pulls back when people get too close, and it's strong, but the buried part of you is strong, too. That part is what makes you inclined to humor my manipulation as long as you see no harm in it, even though you don't really understand its purpose. Rigel shook her head slowly, though she wasn't sure which part of Rosier's words she was denying. What is your purpose? Rosier tilted his head, as though to get a better angle on his thoughts. I want to help the softer part of you win, I suppose. Even if what you said is true, though I don't think it is, that weak part of me is buried for a reason, Rigel said slowly. Did you ever think that it's because I don't want it to win? I'm sorry, Rosier, but I don't think I can give you whatever you're looking for. It might be better if you let it go now. It might be easier, Rosier said, an odd little smile playing about the edges of his mouth, but better. No, I don't think so. Rigel sighed with a small amount of resignation. In other words, you're not going to stop, whatever you're doing. Not until you can put it into words, at least, Rosier said amusedly. Don't worry about it so much. As long as we know where we stand, neither of us can get hurt, so where's the harm? Turn around. Rigel was very much afraid she didn't see the harm, and wouldn't, until it was too late. You actually just want to touch my hair, she said, skeptically. Rosier nodded slightly, still smiling his strange little smile. And that's all? You won't do anything else, like steal the strands for polyjuice? So mistrusting. And you are aware that I don't understand whatever undercurrents you're striving for at all, and that it doesn't mean anything, and... Yes, what were you, a disclaimer in a previous life? Rosier cut her off and used her shoulders to turn her so that she was facing the other end of the couch. Rigel sat stiffly, but a moment later Rosier hooked an arm around her neck and tugged her backwards until her head landed with a thump against his left knee. She stared up at him dumbly, trying to work out where in their conversation she had agreed to lay her head in his lap, while Rosier smirked down at her with no small amount of smugness. She considered getting up and walking away, but where could she go? She couldn't leave Slytherin House due to the curfew, and she certainly couldn't go back to her dorm and listen to Draco explain how emotionally defective she was again. Rosier's smirk softened slightly, and he said, "Close your eyes." Since the alternative was looking up at him and watching him watch her, she did just that, though she did grimace a bit to display her displeasure at his overbearing demeanor. Rosier carded his fingers through her hair slowly, careful not to catch in any knots or scrape her scalp with his nails. It was sort of soothing, she supposed, in a very intrusive kind of way. Then again, her mother went to the hair salon all the time, and paid extra to get a scalp massage while they were shampooing her. This was not so very different. It was strange having her neck on his leg, she supposed, but not in a dangerous way. The only part of her Rosier was actually touching was her head, which, as far as Rigel knew, wasn't a definite indicator of biological sex. In theory, then, letting Rosier comb her hair with his fingers wasn't actually hurting anything, and wouldn't be a danger to her plans. But if there was nothing dangerous about it, then why were little alarm bells ringing insistently in the pit of her stomach? Somewhere between worrying about the situation and telling herself not to worry about it, Rigel fell asleep. -0. -0. End of part 2. There was something unspeakably different about Rigel Black, Alden mused, looking down at the sleeping boy. On the outside, he resembled so many other pure-blooded scions, distinct coloring, delicate bone structure, and good manners to spare. So far, so unremarkable. Once you knew Rigel Black for longer than 2 minutes, however, it became alarmingly clear how not like other pure-blooded scions he really was. The first odd thing Alden had noticed about the Black Heir was how vague he was. Rigel could hold an entire conversation without ever seeming to really focus on it. Part of it was his chronically blank expression, but part of it was a flatness in his eyes that said, more clearly than words, that Rigel Black didn't care. He knew the moment Pansy introduced them that Rigel didn't care who Alden was. Rigel didn't care who Alden's parents were, how much influence Alden would one day wield, or what useful abilities and talents he might possess. Meeting Rigel Black was one of the most interesting things that had ever happened to Alden. Here was a boy who listened without hearing, spoke without really saying anything, and looked right at him without even once calculating his family's net worth. It was as if Rigel didn't see Alden at all, so flat and unaffected his stare had been, and from the start Alden knew he had to see more of Rigel Black. He wanted those eyes to look at him again, because being not seen by Rigel Black was far more interesting than being seen as the rosier heir by 1,000 of his parents' sycophantic friends. He had felt the same sort of thrill on the day he'd first met Edmund Rookwood. It had been at his 5th birthday party. Edmund had walked into the room, handed Alden his present, bowed politely, and walked away again, all without uttering a word. Alden, who had never been more thoroughly dismissed in his short life, was left with a burning desire to make the Rookwood boy see him, acknowledge him, and above all speak to him. It took him months of play dates, arranged outings, and bribery in the form of trips to exotic magical menageries, but in the end, Alden had gotten what he wanted. Meeting Rigel felt the same. Alden wondered what it would take to make those eyes sharpen with life. How difficult would it be to provoke a response from Rigel Black? As it turned out, not difficult at all. One half-registered threat toward his friendship with Pansy, and Rigel was all briar and bramble. Alden hadn't known one person could be equal parts ridiculous and admirable, until he watched Rigel Black trying to climb a Canterbury tree with just a vine and a broken wrist. Oh, how interesting Rigel Black turned out to be. Underneath his lifeless facial expressions and almost insulting dismissal of anything that couldn't be diced, reduced, or boiled into unappetizing slime, Rigel was one of the most volatile things Alden had ever encountered. Rigel Black didn't care, he didn't care, and then all of a sudden he did, and Merlin help anyone standing in his way at that moment. Rigel Black had lines, and the very instant one of his lines was crossed, his demeanor went from dormant to volcanic eruption in the space between heartbeats. Rigel was unpredictable, emotional, dangerous, exciting. And then, without warning, the fire was banked again. Just like that, Rigel was all polite smiles, blank stares, slow blinks, and polished unconcern. It was almost enough to make you forget you'd seen the fire raging, almost. And if that wasn't enough, and it was, by Merlin, it really was enough, there was still more to Rigel Black. Beyond the fire, or perhaps living next to the fire, as amazing as that was, there was this other hidden side to Rigel, too. It was soft, hesitant, careful, and difficult to describe in any holistic sense, but sometimes Alden was tempted to use the word good. Rigel Black cared about people. He cared about his friends, his family, people he sort of knew, and people he didn't know at all. Alden had never heard Rigel say a single negative thing about another person, even Greengrass, who had openly accused him of petrifying students. Rigel got angry at people, snapped at them occasionally, and in the case of a certain Lestrange openly defied people when he was at his most obstinate, but he never picked fights for the sake of it, and he forgave the offender shortly after his own temper had cooled. Never had Alden met anyone so willing to accept and ignore the mistakes of others. Maybe it was this that made Rigel so different. Then again, there were plenty of good, forgiving people in the world who cared about others and avoided fights. It could simply be the novelty of seeing such qualities in someone who could afford to be otherwise. Rigel had the power, political, social, and magical if half the stories about him were true, to strut about like that Lestrange twerp if he pleased, and most people would still doff their hats as he passed. But no, that wasn't what made Rigel different. Draco Malfoy was perfectly polite most days, despite the power his family wielded. And Pansy was undeniably good, even though no one could have expected such a spoiled little girl to turn out so wonderful. Maybe it wasn't the goodness in Rigel, then, that was so captivating. Perhaps, Alden mused, it was the darkness. Deep in Rigel's eyes, beneath the calm observing Ravenclaw and the fiercely defensive Gryffindor, there was something that slithered, slow and subtle and far from the light. Alden knew Rigel had no idea a part of his soul was brittle and black, but Alden had seen it. It was in his body language whenever the subject of blood traitors came up at the dinner table, it was in his eyes every time he looked at Severus Snape, and it had been there in the flash of unwitting understanding that crossed his face the night Alden admitted to hating his parents. Even though Rigel loved his friends and family and mentor, there was an unbreachable wall between he and them. Alden didn't fully understand what inspired that wall yet, but it was built high with lies and smiles and the illusion of calm, cool stone. Looking down at the boy, Alden wondered if Rigel would ever know how alike the two of them were. Maybe that was it, that's what made knowing Rigel Black so important to him. Even though Rigel professed to love his family, Alden could tell that Rigel understood what it was like to never quite be what your parents wanted you to be, to defy expectations naturally, not because you strove to, but because their expectations were so wildly off the mark as to be inapplicable. Rigel understood how it felt to lie to people you loved, not because you wanted to trick them, but so they didn't end up as bitter and hurt and disappointed as you were. Most of all, Alden thought, Rigel understood hunger. It was so obvious when Rigel looked at Professor Snape. Though his face was blank, there was a yearning in his gaze, a deep, desperate desire to be recognized, acknowledged, and approved of. It was painful to see, Rigel's hunger, and even though that burning desire to be recognized was surely what had ensured his place in the House of Snakes in the first place, Alden very much wanted to make it go away. Alden. Alden looked up at Edmund, who was looking down at Rigel's admittedly uncharacteristic position with a raised eyebrow and a slightly disapproving expression. Yes, Edmund. Has Alice retired already? It is an hour past curfew, Edmund informed him. Alden blinked in slight surprise. Had he been ruminating so long? I see. Thank you for letting me know, old chap. I'll be along shortly, but don't bother leaving the light on. Sometimes Alden liked to pretend they were worldly, burnt-out old bachelors, he and Edmund, but for some reason Ed never found it quite so amusing as he did. Rigel should retire as well, Edmund said neutrally. As you can see, he already has. Alden quirked a grin, but I acknowledge your point. Would you like to carry him? Edmund lowered his eyelashes the way he only did when he thought Alden was being deliberately obtuse. Neither of us can enter the second-year dorms, and Rigel would be highly offended if he were to discover someone had moved him without his knowledge. Offended? Unlikely, Alden said thoughtfully, but he would certainly be distressed. Edmund's face was, as usual, unfathomable. I was not under the impression that you were averse to causing Rigel distress of late, Alden. Alden stiffened involuntarily. I'm trying to help him, Edmund. By consistently disregarding his boundaries. By attempting to show him that his current boundaries are unhealthy and unnecessary, Alden corrected softly. I'm not scaring him, Ed. I know that's what Draco thinks, but Rigel isn't afraid of other people. He's alienated from them. He sees no reason to be close to other people, and doesn't understand why anyone would want to be close to him. It is confusion he feels, and impatience. He doesn't like it, Alden, Edmund said, his voice deep with concern. Because he doesn't know what it means, Alden said patiently. He's worried I want something from him, something he won't want to give me, and that makes him uneasy, as any Slytherin would be when he senses unspoken terms on the table. What do you want from him, Alden? Can you pretend that you do this? He gestured to where Alden's hand still rested in Rigel's hair, for his own good, when surely he cannot benefit from it while asleep. Edmund asked. He's young, yet. Alden let his mouth curl into the slightest of sneers. I am young yet, Edmund. You think I would touch a boy the same age as our pansy? Like that? I was teasing at Christmas, Ed, you know that. This is, his fingers detangled themselves from Rigel's hair gently. I was thinking, and forgot I was doing it. I want nothing from him. Nothing from him now, or nothing until he is older? Edmund asked. Alden bit back a huff. Nothing at all now, and nothing he does not agree to when he is older. Edmund's throat made a noise like a boulder shifting, and Alden knew he was fighting a laugh. Perhaps you should explain that to young Draco, then. And Rigel too, for that matter. Alden smirked. Draco's more amusing when he's riled. As for Rigel, I don't think he'd believe me if I told him I didn't want anything of him. He'd suspect I was covering up for an expectation I didn't dare utter. Better for him to think I'm merely teasing him, taking my boredom out on him. As long as he can ascribe a harmless motive my attentions, he won't worry so much. He looked down at Rigel, taking in his pale face, and the slight line between his eyebrows that apparently even sleep did not ease. "Merlin knows the boy worries enough for 10 ministers of magic." "Wake him up," Alden Edmund said, shaking his head with slow amusement as he turned away, "and get to bed before you start waxing poetic worse than Lady Parkinson." "Perish the thought," Alden said, glancing up again and letting a smile twist his lips wryly. "And, Alden," Edmund said, turning back with a slightly fond expression on his face. "What, more advice?" "You're smothering me tonight, Ed," Alden Edmund said again, his voice serious. "Yes, Edmund," Alden said, equally serious. Edmund considered him gravely. "Do you remember the first piece of advice I ever gave you?" Alden blinked as his mind transported him back to that day, the day he'd finally succeeded in his first ever ambition, make Edmund Rookwood acknowledge him. He was 5 years old, dressed in sensible play robes that his nurse elf wouldn't have trouble getting stains out of, and he had dragged Edmund outside to see his family's stable. The week before, one of the Siberian Sabalians had given birth to a litter of baby cubs. They were finally healthy enough to visit, and Alden had traded 2 weeks of his nightly dessert for his father to invite Edmund over to see the little silver cats before their coats took on the mottled spots they were known for. Edmund sat down in the hay, right there in it, without setting down a blanket or even checking it for animal droppings first, and pulled the smallest Sabalian into his lap. Alden hovered for a moment, not sure following his guest's example was the right thing to do, but also unsure whether deviating and getting a blanket for himself would be rude, or worse, make him look weak. Eventually, Alden decided to kneel carefully in the hay next to Edmund, telling him all about the new cubs, what he wanted to name all of them, how many his father was going to keep and how many would be sold, and all sorts of other things like what Sabalians ate, why their fur changed colors when they spent enough time in the sun, and so on. Eventually he ran out of things to say, and so he just sat there, petting each of the Sabalians in turn, while Edmund calmly held that one little Sabalian in his lap, just stroking its fur and not saying anything, as usual. Edmund never said anything to Alden. When his father asked Edmund a question, the boy answered very politely, if a bit shortly, but when Alden asked him questions, Edmund just looked at Alden, as though he didn't understand English at all. They sat in the hay for an hour, then 2. Alden stared fidgeting, his ankles itching from being in the hay for so long, his stomach rumbling with hunger. Still, Edmund sat there with that Sabalian cub, seemingly content to do nothing else but pet it all afternoon. Eventually, the silence started driving Alden crazy, so he started talking again. He talked about the lessons he had to go to now that he was 5. He told Edmund about the closet in the servants' wing he thought was haunted, because sometimes he could hear eerie groaning and thumping sounds coming from within when his parents weren't home. He told him about how he liked his nurse elf, Igor, better than his human nurse, Elsef, who made him drink this awful brown potion when he got the hiccups. "I get the hiccups a lot," he remembered saying, "and mother thinks it's because I never stop talking long enough to get air into my lungs, so my diaphragm interrupts me to make sure I don't die." He looked at Edmund expectantly, because usually when he repeated his mother's explanation for his frequent bouts of hiccups people laughed, or at least smiled. Edmund just looked at him, though, and kept petting the Sabalian. Alden's face fell a bit, but he brightened determinedly. "Tomorrow, I'm going to ask father to take us to Murphy's magic menagerie. One of the maids says they have pine-toluns there. Pine-toluns are really bright, and their feathers glow in the dark. I think you'll like them, but if you don't, they also have." Alden. Alden broke off to stare at Edmund, slightly open-mouthed. "You talked?" Edmund's lips made the slightest of twitches, but Alden felt like he'd just won first place in a juniors Quidditch League racing tournament. Alden clapped his hands in his excitement, forgetting that his father had told him clapping one's hands was a perfectly obnoxious way to convey pleasure. "Say something else." Edmund considered him for a long moment, little head tilted slightly to the side. "You don't have to try so hard." Alden blinked. "What?" "You're nice," Edmund said slowly, "and funny. You're gentle with animals," and Edmund's hand, the one not still petting the Sabalian, gestured at him sort of helplessly. "I already like you. So you don't have to try to be my friend so much." Alden shook his head, and the memory faded. "Yes," he said, smiling slightly, "I remember." "What of it?" "It still applies," Edmund said. He turned and walked toward their dorm, leaving Alden to puzzle out his meaning. Edmund wanted him to back off and let Rigel dictate the terms of their friendship, he supposed, but Alden was still of the same mind he'd been all those years ago. When you were being a friend, there was no such thing as trying too hard. He put a hand on Rigel's shoulder and shook him gently awake. He could tell the moment Rigel returned to consciousness, because the line between his eyebrows immediately deepened, and new lines, small but unmistakable, formed around his mouth. "Time for bed," Rigel Rosier said, "unless you want me to take you to mine." Rigel's face flushed immediately, and the boy sat up so quickly Alden was surprised he didn't get whiplash. I didn't." Alden let himself laugh aloud, and had a grin on his face by the time Rigel turned around to glare approvingly at him. "You shouldn't say things so casually, Alden," Rigel said seriously, his cheeks still a bit red, though he'd managed to control most of it by then. "Why not?" Alden said, not missing the way Rigel used his given name. Perhaps he was still muddled by sleep. "You won't get the wrong idea, you know me too well." Rigel sighed, but didn't argue the point. "Go to bed, Snakelet," Alden said, manufacturing a yawn for good measure. "Go on, get." Rigel went, though he did send Alden one last half-cautious half-confused look over his shoulder as he left. Alden stretched out his cramped leg briefly before following suit. On second thought, he hoped Edmund had decided to leave the light on. -0. HP. -0. When Rigel got back to her dorm, the light was off and all her roommates were already in their beds. She shucked her shoes by her trunk and fumbled for a moment in her pockets until she remembered that Selwyn had made her move her wand to the pocket on her right side hip. She took out the wand, asked it quietly to wake her up an hour earlier than usual, then stowed it underneath her pillow. "Why are you getting up at 4? Rigel turned toward Draco's bed, but couldn't see whether his eyes were open or not in the darkness. His voice didn't sound muddled, so Rigel concluded he'd probably been lying awake for some time. "I fell asleep in the common room, so I don't need as much sleep tonight," Rigel answered quietly, mindful of Blaze and Theo sleeping, presumably, not far away. "But what will you do with the extra hour?" Draco asked reasonably, though his voice was a bit annoyed. "We haven't been able to go running since the lockdown started, and we don't even have that much homework since the teachers have been going easy on us lately." "I'm sure I'll find something to do," Rigel said. "Like the studying you said you were going to do tonight?" Draco asked sarcastically. "Maybe," Rigel said carefully, "or I might review for the transfiguration test we have next week. Want to go over your notes with me?" There was a tense silence, then Draco said, petulantly, "I'm still mad at you." "I know," Rigel said, though she couldn't stop a small smile spreading over her face. Despite the put-out tone, the heat had gone from his voice. "I'm not waking up at 4, he added sullenly. "That's fine," Rigel agreed instantly, "I'll wait for you." Draco was quiet for a while, and Rigel started to think he had fallen asleep, until he said, "Rigel." "Yes, Draco." "What's the worst part?" Rigel closed her eyes, though Draco couldn't see it. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Tell me." Rigel wasn't sure she should admit it, but... "You not talking to me, Draco. That's the worst part. It upsets me that I've pushed you so far away." Draco cleared his throat before saying, "Well, you know how to fix it." "Knowing is not the same thing as being capable of doing," Rigel said wearily. "I know it seems cold to say that there are things more important than our friendship, Draco, but there are. I can't neglect those things because they upset you, though it does make me sorry when they do." She heard Draco blow out a breath in frustration. "I know I'm not the center of your universe, Rigel. I'm not quite as conceited as everyone thinks, you know. I don't expect you to make a bunch of unreasonable sacrifices for me. I know your life is complicated, or something. I've always known that, since we first became friends, because you told me so. That's fine. Keep the big things to yourself, I understand. It's just, the idea that everything you do is somehow tied to something you can't explain to me, that's a bit hard to swallow, Rigel. Everyone has mysteries, but it's as if every single part of your life is mysterious and unreachable. How can anyone be friends with a complete mystery?" "I'm not a mystery," Draco. Rigel tried to explain. "There's no big secret or answer at the end of all the lies. It's not a game I'm playing, or a riddle I've presented the world with. This is my life. It just happens to be confusing to anyone not living it, I suppose." You know what was a game? Draco asked mildly. That exercise in Dumbledore's class was a game, Rigel, but you felt threatened enough on an instinctual level that you unconsciously cast a highly dangerous shield to protect yourself from a rubber ball. Anyone else would have taken the hit if they thought I wouldn't shield them in time, and you should know that it still greatly upsets me whenever I think about how completely you dismissed my ability, without even thinking about it, apparently, but not you. Rigel can't take a hit from a rubber ball, even if it's only a game. Do you know what kind of person that makes you, Rigel? Crazy. Rigel said lightly, it runs in my family, you know. Damaged Draco said flatly, that's the kind of hyper-paranoid reaction that Exorers have when someone surprises them in a crowded room. I wrote to my father about the incident, without using your name, of course, and he said that I should avoid being alone with that classmate, because children with traumatic childhoods can be unpredictable and sometimes accidentally dangerous. Rigel swallowed. My childhood wasn't traumatic. But you are accidentally dangerous, aren't you, Rigel? Draco said softly, that shield destroys everything it touches, but you used it without a second thought. I didn't, Rigel said, it was my magic. You always say that, Rigel, but magic only responds to will. The truth is you felt threatened in that classroom, with me and Pansy next to you, and no actual enemy or threat in sight, Draco said firmly. Your magic responded to your fear and manifested in a dangerous and excessive way. You can say you didn't mean to, or that it was an accident, but that doesn't really make it better. People aren't usually that scared accidentally when there's nothing to be afraid of. Rigel didn't know how to explain better than she already had, but she couldn't let Draco keep thinking she was a dangerous paranoid schizophrenic. They locked people away for that sort of thing, and wouldn't that put pain to all her plans? I wasn't afraid, Draco. It was probably the adrenaline from thinking and reacting so fast over and over. That's the point of the game, to make you react without thinking, and yes, my magic overreacted to the level of threat, but that doesn't mean I'm incapable of evaluating situations and calculating appropriate responses to them, Rigel said. You've been my friend for 2 years, almost. Have I ever hurt you? Or anyone? I know you're not going to hurt me, Rigel, Draco said with a sigh. That's not the point. It wasn't just that class. Whenever something goes wrong, you're always the first to react. That's good, to an extent, but it's also telling. It means you're so paranoid that you're walking around in a constant state of alert. Even when you shouldn't have to be expecting danger, it's as if you are anyway, and it makes you a bit volatile at times. No, it doesn't, Rigel said, frowning. You're twisting the facts around. Am I? Draco said mildly, I've had a lot of time to think about this. You see, there are also times when everyone but you reacts to something. I thought that meant you were only sometimes on edge, but now I think you don't react because you've already recognized and dismissed the source as a threat, not because you're so zoned out you don't notice. That's true, isn't it? You're not nearly as unobservant and out of it as you want everyone to think. This was getting ridiculous, Rigel thought, and they would never get any sleep this way. I'm not. It's because of your condition, isn't it? Draco said, so quietly that Rigel barely heard him. She paused before automatically refuting him. Maybe, denying things wasn't the right way to go about convincing Draco. He knew too much, had observed too much already, so telling him he was wrong would only make him think she was lying again. Perhaps it was better to tell him he was right, but in a way that still prevented him from seeing what was true. Draco was still speaking, very softly. It occurred to me that getting hit by the ball would have hurt you a lot more than other people, because of your problem. So in that respect, your magic was still overreacting, but not as much. Then I thought that being so paranoid was a result of being hyper-aware of everything around you already. If your condition didn't just make it painful for things to touch you, but actually made you extremely sensitive to your environment as a side effect, it would explain why you reacted so quickly to things. It might also explain, it would be understandable, then, if you were afraid on an unconscious level of everything, all the time. That, in turn, would explain why you either overreact to things or don't react at all, if you suppress the instinct in time. Rigel thought it was alarming how much internal sense her friend's argument could make while still being entirely wrong. He also seemed to have either forgotten that she'd assured him her condition wasn't painful. That or he assumed she was lying about that, but not about the rest of it. It was almost enough to make her doubt the ability of people to ever figure anything out without being told, and that was a comforting enough thought that she wasn't even very upset about being told it was natural for her to be a coward because of her imaginary medical condition. "You're very observant," she said, because that, at least, was true. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," Draco said. "I just wanted you to know that I understand, even though I don't like it. It upsets me to think that every second of the day you're afraid that something is going to happen and you're going to get hurt, but I understand that it's not your fault. The reason I stayed angry at you for so long is because you could have told me all of that. You already told me about your condition, so you could have just explained why your magic lashed out like that, instead of making me figure it out on my own. That, more than anything, tells me that even when you trust me with your secrets, you still don't trust me with them." Rigel wasn't sure what he meant by that, but Draco was happy to explain. "You don't come to me when you have problems relating to the secrets I already know, and you don't trust me with the consequences and implications of your problems. As if you thought once I knew the secret, it would be enough for me. Like our friendship didn't mean that I wanted to help you, not just know why you're hurting," Draco said, his voice getting hoarse with talking so much, and thick with emotion. "You stopped me when I tried to help you before, and I understood because even being really subtle isn't all that subtle to other Slytherins, but this time you could have explained things to me. Instead, you let me stay mad at you, and then by the time I figured it out I was mad at you for not telling me, and, don't you see how much easier it would be if you actually trusted me instead of just pretending to trust me?" Rigel took a breath, thought over what Professor Snape had told her about getting Draco's forgiveness, and said, "You're right. I should trust you with more of my problems. I didn't want to bother you, because I have quite a number of problems, and it wouldn't be fair to dump them onto your shoulders as well, but I should trust you to be able to decide which problems you can help me with for yourself, especially if you really do want to help." Draco shifted in his bed, and Rigel could tell he'd turned toward her by the slight increase in volume when he spoke. "Thank you, Rigel." Rigel shifted, getting as comfortable as she could in her school robes and thinking she could finally get some sleep. She debated resetting her alarm to compensate for the time spent talking with Draco, but decided a bit less sleep wouldn't kill her. "So?" Draco said expectantly when she'd stopped shifting. "So, what?" Rigel asked. At Draco's exasperated noise, her eyebrows lifted. "You want to start solving my problems right now? How else will I know you aren't just saying this?" Draco asked archly, or as archly as one could at a near whisper. "Right. Snape had said Draco would require proof of change." "Okay," Rigel said, racking her brain for a problem that Draco either already knew about or wouldn't be able to learn anything from. That ruled out her problem with Leo, the trouble she was having with one of Flint's charms essays, and, actually, that was pretty much it. Now that she thought about it, there were a lot of things she was having trouble with that she could have been talking to her friends about. Part of her said that if her friends formed the expectation of being involved in her problems, it would make the ones she didn't involve them with more obvious, but another part of her didn't see the harm with letting Draco feel like a useful friend by sharing a couple of her problems with him. And speaking of not seeing the harm in things. "Okay," she said again, "well, as you know, tonight Rosier invited me to study with him. This conversation doesn't end with, so I ignored him and took a nap instead, does it?" Draco guessed. "Not exactly," Rigel muttered. "Will you let me explain the whole problem before you jump in, though?" "Sure, go ahead." "No, wait," Draco said. There was a rustling noise, then the sound of Draco's wand scraping against the bedside table lightly, then, Lumos. His wand tip glowed softly, and Rigel glanced quickly at Theo and Blaze's beds. Both had their eyes closed, and Theo was still snoring, but, again, that didn't necessarily mean both were still asleep, if they had ever been. Draco pulled the curtains around his bed closed on the three sides not facing Rigel, and muttered, "Quietus," while pointing his wand at each curtain. He motioned for Rigel to join him in the makeshift fort, and Rigel mentally resigned herself to sleeping in tomorrow after all. When Rigel was situated and the last curtain had been pulled, Draco frowned hard at his wand tip until the soft ball of light slowly detached itself from the tip of the wand and hovered in the air above them, like a miniature star. They had learned how to detach the spell from their wands in defense class, so that their wands would be free for other spells, and so that the light wouldn't go out if they lost hold of their wand. Dumbledore was full of helpful tricks like that. Draco stowed his wand under his own pillow, and Rigel thought briefly that Selwyn would probably have suggested Rigel transfer her wand to her pocket once more when she moved from her bed. That, however, was unlikely to help convince Draco that Rigel trusted him. "All right, now explain what you're doing about Rosier," Draco said. Rigel nodded. "Tonight he noticed I was feeling a bit off. He took my book and told me to relax more, and then offered to help me relax." Rigel. By stroking my hair again, Draco, stop mentally hemorrhaging. "It wasn't anything weird," Rigel assured him. At Draco's patently skeptical look, she amended that to, "It wasn't too weird, at least." "Really, that's all that happened?" I laid down on the couch, he brushed my hair, and I fell asleep because it was sort of relaxing after a while. "Well, I can see all sorts of problems with this scenario," Draco sighed, "but what do you think the problem is?" "He admitted to manipulating me in order to make me let him touch my hair," Rigel said, "but he didn't say why he would want to do that, or what he expected in return, so the problem is that I can't find a good enough motive for it, but at the same time Rosier doesn't seem the type to do things for no good reason. So I'm afraid of the reason, I guess." Draco gazed at her blankly. "Did you ask him for a reason?" "Yes," Rigel said. "His answer was that he thinks deep down I want to be affectionate with my friends, but don't know how, so he's taken it upon himself to show me how, or something. It sort of makes sense, I suppose." "No, it really doesn't," Draco said flatly. "I mean, Pansy plays with our hair all the time," Rigel said, "so maybe he thought that would be a safe place to start, in facilitating my familiarity with affection. It would make sense if he was your therapist, but he's not, he's just your friend," Draco said, rolling his eyes. "He probably fed you that answer because you couldn't object to it without sounding like a masochist who likes to be withdrawn and tetchy." Rigel thought about this. "So what's the real motive?" "Maybe he really is just bored. He does tease Pansy a lot, and Rookwood and Selwyn, too. Maybe he's just letting his guard down and doing the same to me, since we've become closer friends now. And maybe he's a Hufflepuff," Draco scoffed. Rigel scowled back. "I'm trying, okay? How is anyone supposed to understand why other people do things unless they tell them? You see how important honesty is." Rigel huffed with amusement, but said nothing. Draco pursed his lips, then said, hesitantly, "Rigel, did it occur to you that Rosier simply, well, how much do you know about, you know?" Rigel blinked. "What?" Draco rolled his eyes. "You know. Merlin, Rigel, sex. How much do you know about sex?" Rigel choked on a laugh. "Plenty, thanks. At least, enough to know that she wasn't interested in anything so uncomfortable sounding." Draco pinched the bridge of his nose. "Don't laugh, I'm just saying, Rosier probably just likes you, simple as that. And he wants to get you used to touching him, because he'll want to do even more later, and, well, doesn't that make the most obvious sense?" Rigel stopped laughing and nodded. "Yes, that's one of the things that crossed my mind. I dismissed it, though, because we're both men." Draco grimaced. "Rigel, I don't know how your family does things, but most purebloods consider it rude to preference one gender over." "I know that," Rigel interrupted quickly. "Magic no Siri, my father had his fair share of good times on both sides of the pitch. I was going to say young, Draco, we're both so young. Even if Rosier is old enough to start that sort of thing, I'm not, so that would argue for an unwieldy long-term plan in place, which I honestly don't see being the case." "Why not?" Draco said reasonably. "Slytherins are known for long-term plots." "Yes, but, I mean, that would be ridiculous," Rigel said. "All that time and effort spent on setting the stage for one romantic dalliance that might not even pan out. And for me, I can barely tear myself away from a cauldron long enough to spend time with my friends. I'd be an awful boyfriend. I'm not in good standing with the pure-blooded circles, either, because of my father and uncles, so it's not even good politics. Rosier would have better targets for that sort of thing, don't you think? Plus he's admitted what he's doing to my face, which makes me even more inclined to think he isn't taking it very seriously. In fact, yes, it probably is just a joke or something. He'll get over it soon, I expect. Do you know, I'm glad I talked with you about this." Rigel smiled at Draco. "It seems more clear now that I've said it out loud." Draco just stared at her. then said, I'm a lot less worried than I was before, too. Honestly, I'm not sure Rosier knows what he's gotten himself into. Rigel wasn't sure what Draco meant by that, exactly, but as it didn't sound complimentary she was content to ignore it. We should do this more often, Draco, Rigel said, in a better mood now that she had Rosier's game figured out. No kidding, Draco said, looking a bit like he'd bitten into something he might have been allergic to, after all. Did you, have anything else you want to talk about? Rigel was tempted to ask Draco what he thought about Patil's accusation concerning what she should be doing about the basilisk, but probably she had lent on her friend enough for one day. Nothing that won't keep. Maybe I can ask Pansy, anyway. Draco smiled widely. She'd like that, I think. In fact, let's do it tomorrow. Do you have to help Uncle Severus after class? Not tomorrow, Rigel said. We should ask Selwyn to chaperone an expedition outside. The basilisk probably wouldn't leave the castle to threaten students on the grounds, and it's been so nice outside lately. You noticed? Draco said, somewhat incredulously. No, I close my eyes every time I pass a window, Rigel said, letting her face relax into a grin. Doesn't everyone? Only you, Draco laughed. Okay, let's ask Selwyn about going down to the lake tomorrow. In that case, we should get to bed, Rigel said, scooting toward the edge of Draco's four-poster. Rigel, Draco said suddenly with a frown, I know you think Rosier is just messing with you, or relieving boredom, but, what if he isn't? Rigel tilted her head. What do you mean? I mean, say he really does like you, not as a social scheme, or even because you're clever and ambitious and he thinks you'll have political clout one day, Draco said, his head tilted slightly downwards as he looked at her. What if Rosier really, truly likes you as a person? What will you do? Do? Rigel was feeling confused again. Do I have to do anything just because someone likes me? Draco looked like he was fighting a smile. Well, usually people respond one way or another. Either you return their affections, eventually, or you politely decline them. Rigel nodded. That makes sense. So do I have to decide if I like Rosier or not now, just in case he actually likes me? Because I'd rather not think about it, if it's all the same to you. Draco snorted. Do you even know if you like men yet? Rigel blinked. That was an interesting question. I don't dislike the idea on instinct. That seemed like a safe enough answer. Strong preferences one way or the other were considered bad form in some pure-blooded circles, so a neutral stance was the best way to remain unremarkable. It doesn't really matter, though. I'm not interested in romance in any form. Not now, maybe, Draco began sensibly, but Rigel cut him off. Not ever, probably, Rigel said firmly. My work is too important to me. Not ever. But, you can't be serious, Draco said, his face working to come up with an expression equal to the amount of sheer disbelief he apparently felt at hearing that not everyone dreamed of growing up and marrying a nice pureblood and having 1.5 pureblood children. Why not? Rigel asked. You know how busy my life is, Draco, and these are the easy years. After Hogwarts, if I pass the potions mastery, I'll be a full-time brewer and researcher. It'll be years before I make any significant contributions to the field, gain credibility for my recipes, and can afford to take it easy for any amount of time. Romance just doesn't factor into the plan. Draco shook his head, ignoring the fact that romance has very little to do with plans, and even less to do with what Rosier's probably considering. Rigel, you're the heir to an ancient and noble family. You just can't afford to swear off that sort of thing. You have to be married, and produce an heir of your own. Hasn't your father talked to you about that? Otherwise, the family name dies out, and your holdings get relegated to branch houses with no real claim to them. Rigel shrugged a bit, though she had, indeed, momentarily forgotten that Archie had a responsibility to his family name, and no convenient younger sibling to pass that responsibility on to. There's always my uncle, Regulus Black. He can carry on the family name, if it comes to that. He cares for the Black family more than my father ever did, in any case. Draco was still frowning. But don't you mind being the one to mess up generations of inheritance traditions? The line of eldest black males is unbroken for several hundred years, I think. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, but it's kind of a big deal, in some circles. It's just a lot to throw away without giving yourself the chance, I think. Rigel smiled a bit sadly. Family is important, of course, but it's not the only important thing in the world. Helping people is important, too. You could help a lot of people with the black family name, Draco pointed out. Someone else could, I'm sure, but not me. I'm no good at politics and parties. I know what I'm meant to do in life, and getting married and having children won't help me do it, Rigel said. Draco shook his head bemusedly, but said, it's your life, Rigel, but my mother always tells me not to close a door unless you have to, you never know when you'll need alternatives. Rigel raised an eyebrow, are you telling me to consider Rosia's suit? Draco laughed shortly, consider it a trap, maybe. No, I just feel defensive on your future's behalf, hearing you talk so finitely at the wise old age of 12. Rigel laughed a bit in turn, that's 12 and 1/2, actually. An unfathomable difference, I'm sure. You remember this conversation when I turn 13, if you even recognize me by then, of course. I'll just look for the guy up to his eyebrows in trouble, and completely unconcerned despite that, Draco said. When you get in trouble as often as I do, it starts to concern you less and less, Rigel said with exaggerated thoughtfulness. And the less concerned you are, the more concerned the rest of us get, Draco smirked. As long as you're freaking out beyond reason, we'll know it's probably just a rubber ball headed our way, but Merlin help the world if Rigel Black thinks nothing is wrong. One unnecessary shield and they never let you forget it. The next time I erect a man-eating shield to defend myself against a toy on pure instinct, feel free to remind me of it from time to time. Draco rolled his eyes. Did you even use your wand? Rigel groaned softly, I don't want to talk about my wand. Or any of my magic, actually. But talking about things helps, remember. Draco said with false sweetness. Rigel sighed, add it to the list, then, and I'll talk it over with Pansy. You trust Pansy's advice over mine? In a word. Yes. That hurts, Rigel. So you'd prefer my advice to Pansy's? Well, no. That's what I thought. She really is too good for us, isn't she? Yes, she really is, Rigel said, we should tell her that more often, too. What for? Draco grinned, she tells us often, His voice broke on a long yawn and he wiped at his eyes a bit, sorry. Guess it's time for bed after all. Past time, Rigel agreed, opening his curtain and slipping off his bed. Night, Dre. Still not getting up at 4. Let's make it 6. Are you sure? I don't want to inspire bad habits in you. Just this once, Rigel said wryly. Don't force yourself. If you need to wake up at 5:45, I understand. Good night, Draco. Night, Rigel. Rigel. She sighed, yes, Draco. I'm not mad at you anymore. For the first night in far too long, Rigel fell asleep with a smile on her face. -0. HP. -0. The next day, Selwyn reluctantly agreed to organize a trip outdoors once the afternoon classes were finished. She enlisted the help of one prefect in each house, as well as Professors Sinistra and Flitwick for added protection. Anyone who wanted to go had to sign their name on a sheet of paper, which was then double-checked as they left the common room, so that everyone would remain accounted for. There were a lot of students outside by the time the Slytherins got there, but Pansy, Draco, and Rigel managed to find a grassy spot by the edge of the lake, where they sat and ate cookies from a tin Pansy's grandmother had sent her. Pansy seemed to be especially enjoying herself, tilting her head back to take in the evening breeze and sighing every now and then as she looked over the water. I'll be glad when this is all over, she said. You think it's going to end? Rigel asked. All things come to an end, eventually, Pansy said, seeming genuinely unconcerned. And if nothing else, they'll wait until all the students are home for the summer and then flood the castle with poisonous fumes that not even a basilisk could survive, Draco added. Rigel had to admit that sounded like a good idea. She also thought that if the basilisk was being controlled by someone in the school, it would be a lot more vulnerable when that person wasn't around to protect it. Still. It's a while yet before summer comes. You guys don't seem worried at all, Rigel commented. Well, should we be? Draco asked bluntly. He grimaced, then went on, I know it sounds cold, but the pattern of attacks seems clear, even to the rest of the school. No one in Slytherin has been attacked. As long as we keep our heads down, there probably won't be any Slytherin attacks, either. So you think it's definitely a Slytherin controlling the monster? Rigel said. Draco tilted his head consideringly. I'm not sure it's a student, actually, but whoever it is clearly has sympathy for Slytherin House. It could be a coincidence, Rigel argued, though internally she agreed with Draco. Whoever was controlling the snake was against Dumbledore, and likely, though apparently not reliably, working for Riddle. Draco shook his head. If the victims were targets of opportunity alone, there would be a majority of Slytherins. We're the ones most often alone in unfrequented parts of the castle. The dungeons are vast, and largely unpatrolled, so chances are that's where the basilisk has set up its lair, if it's in the castle at all. Snakes like the dark and damp, so the dungeons would be its natural hunting grounds in any case. No Slytherins attacked means the snake is avoiding Slytherins for some reason. If we take reasonable precautions, then, chances are Slytherin House will weather this storm unscathed. But doesn't that bother you? Rigel asked. That Slytherin House will be blamed, maybe rightfully so, for these attacks. It can't be good politics. Can't it? Draco said darkly. You underestimate how easily fear can be put to political use, Rigel. Why are you so bothered about us being bothered or not, Rigel? Pansy asked. Rigel looked out over the lake. I don't know. I guess, I feel guilty, somehow. Because you're a Slytherin. Pansy pressed. Sort of, Rigel said, thinking of what Patil had said, more because I'm a Parselmouth, I think. Of all the people in this school, I have the advantage over the basilisk. I should be doing something to stop it, shouldn't I? Like what? Draco scoffed. You're 12. You don't have to do anything about anything. Let the teachers handle it, and don't go chasing trouble. It's just, the teachers don't seem to be handling it, do they? Rigel said. Why don't they just evacuated the school for a couple of weeks, fumigated it like Pansy suggested, then find the basilisk's body and declare it done with? It seems like they are determined to keep things running along as normal as possible, like there is no imminent threat. That's exactly what they are doing, Pansy nodded. Dumbledore's image is closely bound to the school's. He has to make it seem as though everything's all right, or he loses political clout. It's just like how Mr. Riddle has to make it seem like the Sow party is always running smoothly, even when there are internal power struggles going on, so that he seems to be in control. The minister does the same thing, Draco added, always covering up scandals in the ministry so that it doesn't look like he can't control his own people's doings. It's one thing in political parties and government agencies, Rigel said, frowning, but this is a school. The safety of the students should come first. We've already got escorts everywhere we go, Pansy pointed out. Since they started taking serious precautions, only Lockhart and that girl who deliberately went off on her own have gotten petrified. But we're still not completely safe, Rigel said. I mean, I know it's impossible to make kids safe all the time, but it seems like a basilisk is not something to mess about with. The parents already know what's happening. Kids are being pulled out of school. The media must know already, too, so why not just forget the pretenses and start taking extreme measures? You'd have to ask Dumbledore, Draco said slowly, but my guess is that killing the basilisk isn't enough for him. He wants to find out who's behind the basilisk getting into the castle, and why they are targeting students in the first place, so that he can stop the one behind it, not just the snake itself. And he probably thinks that as long as students are just getting petrified, he can afford to hesitate, Pansy said. It's awful, yes, but is it any worse than the sleeping sickness? Not even a quarter as many kids have been hurt this year. Rigel eyed her friends carefully. It isn't any worse, I suppose, except the potential threat being higher. Speaking of the sickness, though, do you guys think, well, does this situation seem similar to you? Almost eerily similar to last year. Pansy nodded slowly while Draco frowned. Similar enough, why? Draco asked. There wasn't ever proof of who exactly sent the sickness last year, Rigel said, but what if it's the same person who sent the basilisk? Pansy winced slightly and Draco's face went studiously blank. Please be careful what you say aloud, Rigel, Pansy said softly. I'm not saying the possibility hasn't already been discreetly discussed among certain members of our house, but the implications of such an accusation would be dangerous. Draco's jaw clenched. I can't say many would be surprised if you were right. Dumbledore is poised to lose much, if things turn sour at Hogwarts, so it's not a difficult leap to suppose that his enemies might orchestrate such a turn. It's important to keep in mind, however, that Dumbledore has many enemies, and that's assuming Dumbledore is the main target of these attacks, when in fact it could be the light-sides families of the victims. Threatening an heir is the oldest form of blackmail in the book. Rigel wasn't sure she'd read that particular book, but she had read the words etched in blood upon the castle walls, and so she knew that Dumbledore was, in fact, the target of the attacks. She also knew something else, but she wasn't sure if she should tell Pansy and Draco what she'd overheard at the Yule Gala. On the one hand, it implicated Draco's father with near certainty in the events of the sleeping sickness, but on the other hand, Draco already suspected the role Lucius Malfoy had played in events, and likely already suspected a similar involvement this time, if the Sau party was involved at all. Additionally, did she have the right to protect her friends from this, when it involved them so directly? "You're quiet," Rigel Pansy noted. "Too quiet," Draco said dryly, "almost as though you're contemplating hiding something from us. You wouldn't do that, though, would you? Not while we're being so open and honest with one another lately." Rigel grimaced. "I know this isn't a fair question to ask, but if you had a choice between knowing something that might upset you and not knowing, which would you rather? At this point the question is, would we rather know something potentially unpleasant or just live knowing that we don't know something that obviously affects us in a potentially upsetting way?" Draco said with resignation, "Just tell us." Pansy nodded, her face slightly troubled. Rigel asked Draco to cast a basic privacy ward, which wasn't particularly subtle, but which would keep anyone from overhearing. "At the Yule Gala, I overheard a conversation between Mr. Riddle and your father," Draco Rigel said. "It concerned the petrifactions, and it did not paint either of them in a particularly innocent light." Draco's face was tense, but not yet upset. "If I thought words like innocent could ever describe my father, I would be more naive than the girls in our defense class who thought Lockhart had a talent for anything except posturing." "It is always better to know the ins and outs of the political landscape," Pansy said firmly, "no matter how alarming or disadvantageous. A choice made in ignorance can be disastrous." When Rigel still hesitated, Draco said, "You can't protect us from the truth, Rigel." "I can, actually," she thought, "but this time I won't." She told them what she'd heard, and then let them think for a short while. "It seems fairly clear that the Sau party was behind the sickness," then Pansy said with a sigh, "and it seems like Mr. Riddle did have a plan in place at Hogwarts this year, but something has gone wrong. Maybe there's a wild card in play." Draco suggested, frowning. "Mr. Riddle's agent was clearly referred to as male, but you're sure whoever attacked you was female, right, Rigel? Maybe someone is working against Riddle's agenda, either accidentally or on purpose. Father says things are often most confusing when more than one plot overlaps." "What's the Chamber of Secrets, then?" Pansy asked. Draco's father made it seem as though this has happened before. "If this is a copycat crime, it might tell us more about the motive and goals if we know more about the original." "It has," Rigel said. "Mr. Hagrid told me about it. He went to school the last time something like this happened, and he said the petrifactions were the same, except last time there were messages left with the victims, and all of those petrified were Muggleborns." "Muggleborns?" Draco blinked, then his eyes widened. "Oh. The Chamber of Secrets, it's an old Slytherin legend. When Sorlaser left the school, it was said that he left behind a hidden chamber where all his knowledge was stored, which only his heir could open. Once his heir returned to the school and opened the chamber, Sorlaser Slytherin's great work would be finished." "What great work was that?" Rigel asked curiously. Draco looked uncomfortable. "Well, most people think the legend means the purification of the school." Rigel frowned, "But the school's already pure blood only. Why would anyone want to mimic the chamber being opened if Slytherin's great work has already been completed?" "Perhaps the culprit wants people to know he's acting in the name of Slytherin," Pansy said. "Or perhaps, what if the similarity to 50 years ago isn't the intent, but rather a side effect of the same method being used?" Draco said slowly. Rigel raised an eyebrow. "You think there really is a Chamber of Secrets, and that it was in fact opened both 50 years ago and today? That would explain the similarities to the attacks, but not why anyone would open it again, if Slytherin's work is complete." Draco said, "The instrument of the attack must be connected to the Chamber of Secrets." Whoever wanted to cause problems at Hogwarts needed the chamber opened to do it. Maybe they gave no thought to how it would come across in connection to the legend. Pansy frowned, but only the heir of Slytherin can open the chamber. It would have to be the same person as 50 years ago, or their direct descendant I suppose. Still, the line is supposed to be obsolete. It doesn't have to be Slytherin's literal heir, Draco argued. Everyone says Dumbledore is the heir to Merlin, because he was able to lift the staff of Merlin from its place in the Hall of Eternity, but Dumbledore's not directly descendant from Merlin. The heir of Slytherin could be someone the chamber deems worthy of opening it, not necessarily Slytherin's actual blood. Pansy gasped, it's obvious, isn't it? The thing that's been attacking kids is a basilisk. The only way to control it is Parseltongue. So the heir of Slytherin might just mean anyone who's a Parselmouth. Draco shot a look at Rigel, who lifted her hands in open denial. It isn't me. Draco and Pansy actually laughed at that. We know, Rigel, Pansy said, then her face fell. It's just, if this gets out, that's exactly what other people will think. We know there's got to be another Parselmouth, but the odds of 2 Parselmouths being in the school at once have got to be phenomenally low. A lot of people already think I did it, Rigel said unconcernedly, and they're thinking it doesn't make it true. As long as the Aurors don't listen to idle gossip, I think I'll be fine. Draco blanched at the mention of Aurors, and Rigel grimaced, but didn't know what to say. Lucius' part in the plot wasn't certain, but he didn't seem to be rolling in plausible deniability. Lord Malfoy is smart, Draco, Pansy said comfortingly, and it was clear from what Rigel overheard that neither he nor Riddle meant for any kids to be petrified. This is someone else's doing, and in the end your father couldn't have been involved very much, or he wouldn't have had so many questions. Speaking of, Rigel said, how high in the Sau party is Professor Snape, exactly? That's a good question, Pansy said carefully. No one is really sure, I think. Lord Riddle obviously holds the professor in high esteem. He always makes a point to converse with him at social functions, usually somewhere private. I've heard from others that Snape sometimes goes so far as to give counsel to Lord Riddle, so Riddle obviously favors him greatly. On the other hand, Professor Snape comes to so few social gatherings, it's hard to get a consistent read on their public relationship. Uncle Severus is also notoriously close to Dumbledore, Draco commented. Dumbledore seeks his counsel on things sometimes as well, I've heard. My father admires Uncle Severus greatly, and would trust him at his back in a heartbeat, but at the same time he sometimes cautions me about being too open with my godfather, specifically about information. It makes me wonder if Uncle Severus isn't playing both sides of the party lines. Is that not allowed? Rigel asked. Plenty of people are neutral and move between the two sides politically and socially. The neutrals are all on the fringes, though, Draco said dismissively. Uncle Severus is in deep, really deep, with both parties. He's a political anomaly, I guess. Some people would call that a spy, Rigel said quietly. Yes, well, Draco said, in the end, all it means is that Uncle Severus can do pretty much as he pleases, which is, of course, why he lives the way he does. I see, Rigel said, though in reality she wasn't sure she did. It seemed like a lot more work to be embroiled in both parties than it would have been to just stay out of it completely, as she planned on doing. Then again, Snape's expertise in potions was probably highly sought after, so perhaps it was hard for him to remain politically aloof. Let's talk about something besides politics, Pansy said, sighing, and not this Chamber of Secrets business, either. We can't do anything about it, so discussing it does no good. Let's talk about Rigel's magic, Draco said, smirking rather evilly. Are you still having trouble with it? Pansy asked, concerned. You seem to be doing quite well in our classes, you almost always get the spell right off, in fact. Not almost always, always, Draco said. It's a bit disconcerting, actually. I bet you practice them ahead of time, right? Rigel shook her head. It's my magic. It just knows how to do things. They exchanged patently disbelieving looks. Magic is a force of nature, Draco said, like wind or lightning. Wizards have the ability to manipulate that force, but our manipulation of it doesn't make the magic sentient. You have to stop thinking about magic like you would an animal of some kind, or it's only going to seem harder to control, because you'll be subconsciously influencing it to be that way. That's what Professor Snape said, Rigel started. And Merlin forbid we believe anything experienced professors tell us. Draco rolled his eyes. Rigel narrowed her eyes at him, but what if he's wrong? What if magic really is semi-sentient? Pansy tilted her head consideringly. If it were, there would have been some sign of it by now, don't you think? A magical rebellion, or something. Has there ever been a house elf rebellion? Rigel countered. You think magic is like house elves? Draco snorted. No way. House elves are much easier to control. Rigel frowned, but said, so you admit that magic has to be controlled, as though it wouldn't act the way wizards want it to unless we made it. Draco frowned back. Yes. Just like a river wouldn't collect itself into a reservoir unless humans built a dam to make it do so. That doesn't make the river sentient. Okay, Rigel said, but how can we say there are no signs that magic is sentient, when all the signs that might mean just that are interpreted as simply a person not having good enough control over their magic? You mean accidental magic, Pansy said, but accidental magic isn't magic going wild by itself, it is magic responding to a child's distress or desire. The child wants something he or she can't make happen on their own, and their magic responds automatically. But the child isn't really controlling the magic, Rigel said. A person can't control their heart beating, Pansy pointed out, but it beats on, even when they sleep, adjusting in speed depending on how fast the person needs their blood circulating. All a heart can do is beat, though Rigel said, it does so because it is programmed to beat, and to adjust to different chemicals released by the brain in response to a handful of physical situations. A person's heart can't choose to slow down, for instance, when its owner is nervous, even if it might be in the best interest of the person to have a slow heartbeat, like if they were subjected to a pulse monitoring spell by a neuro while being interrogated. Magic isn't like that. Magic responds to the child's need, yes, but then it chooses how to respond in a way appropriate to the situation. Draco hesitated. I'm not sure that's quite how it works. Even if a child has no idea what a hover charm is, his magic can still lift a box of cookies from the highest shelf and bring it down to him, Rigel said. That suggests that magic knows things that its user doesn't necessarily know. The child would have had hover charms cast in close proximity to him, Draco said. Accidental magic can regurgitate spells a child has experienced before, can't it? I think magic does have a kind of pattern recognition ability, especially children's magic, because a child's magic isn't formed as much as an adult's magic. His face was scrunched slightly as he went on. It's like, oh, I read this in a book once, but it's been so long. I think it's because a child's magical core is more wild, more natural. It's impressionable, in a way. That's why children develop light and dark affinities before they ever get proper schooling. It's environmental, to an extent. Their magic remembers, but the way a block of clay remembers a design pressed into it, not because it's sentient. What about when my magic cast the expulsive shield? Rigel said, there's no way anyone has ever performed that shield around me when I was too young to remember it. It's just too dangerous to be cast around children. Still, my magic cast the shield without my input, before I had ever heard of the shield. How can that be, unless the magic knew how the shield was made without me telling it how? And how could it choose that spell, among all the spells I know and don't know, unless it was sentient to some extent? You can't have something that responds creatively to environmental stimuli without calling it sentient. That's what sentient means. Sentience isn't the ability to respond to things, Pansy corrected apologetically, it's the ability to perceive things, to be self-aware. Magic only responds to wizard will, it's a reaction, that's all. No, it isn't, Rigel said. You already admitted that magic exists in two forms, bound to wizards as formed magic, and also as free magic. Freedom is characteristic of sentience, is it not? It doesn't mean magic is free to act as it pleases in the wild, Draco said, exasperated. It only means that it hasn't got a form yet. Free magic is useless magic. It's not even magic, really, just the energy with potential to be used as magic by wizards. Like heat in the air isn't really a fire. All the different analogies were getting confusing, Rigel reflected as she tried to explain her thoughts in a way that made sense. If magic isn't sentient, then how do you explain my magic? It's tricky, and unnecessarily creative at times, don't you think? If it was responding to my will alone, it would do so expediently, but instead it does things weirdly, as though trying to mess with my head on purpose. Draco and Pansy exchanged another dubious look. You sound a bit paranoid about it, Rigel. Draco said, not to be disparaging, but I think you're making a bit fuss over something minor. A lot of kids our age have trouble controlling their magic. There's a kid in Hufflepuff who makes bubbles come out of his wand every time he tries to transfigure a liquid. It's not about control, Rigel said. When I try to do something, my magic is perfectly controlled. My magic acts when I'm not trying to do anything, though. It acts on its own. Randomly. Pansy pressed, because it seems to me that whenever your magic does something you didn't specifically tell it to, it's usually a result you could have reasonably been unconsciously seeking. That shield charm was a response to you perceiving a threat. You knocked Jordan unconscious when he threatened you. You blew up the dummies in Kirill's class because he was treating you unfairly. Do you see how your magic isn't as random as you think? I know you feel out of control, but you really aren't. Rigel sighed, but didn't argue anymore. She knew, somehow, that they were wrong. If her magic was a dead thing that she wielded, utilizing it would be difficult. She would have to work to perform a spell, instead of just work to understand the theory behind it. Rigel's magic performed just as well when she didn't use wand movements, even when she didn't use a wand, for that matter. The magic wasn't connected to or dependent upon anything she herself was doing, whether that was saying the right incantations, making the right wand movement, visualizing the results, or anything. All she had to do was ask, and it happened. It was weird, and she felt uneasy about it. She also felt guilty somehow, as though she were getting something without earning it or even understanding it. Draco and Pansy didn't understand, though, so she let the matter go for now. Someday she would find a better way to explain. Eventually they stopped talking and just relaxed, turning their faces to the breeze. Rigel considered meditating, but she wasn't in the mood to look at the failed experiment lounging her one of her mental armchairs right now. So instead, she just stared out at the lake, watching its peaceful waves rock gently against the. A whirl of white sprung from the water's surface, not far from shore. It wriggled and twisted about in the air as it rose, but strangely didn't make the slightest ripple in its wake. A moment later, a voice like a broken whistle told them why. Black. Black, where are you? I demand you attend me this instant. Rigel felt her eyebrows lift, too distracted by the sight of Myrtle, spitting mad and gasping for air as though she really had held her breath swimming from her bathroom pipes to the surface of the lake to stop her expression betraying her utter surprise. Myrtle spotted them in the next instant, and floated over. Surprisingly enough, most students ignored the sight of a ghost floating out of the lake. Rigel supposed Hogwarts had already conditioned most of them to accept peculiarities with aplomb, if nothing else. Black. I've been looking everywhere for you. You'll never believe what happened, the ghost fumed, her eyes flashing over the rim of her horned spectacles. The nerve of some people. I mean, there I was, minding my own business in the U-bend, when some barking mad bint lobs a book through my head. Through it? Rigel blinked. I'm very sorry to hear that, Myrtle. But, why are you telling me? Myrtle looked highly affronted, saying, you told me to report any suspicious activity to you. Rigel was about to say that the situation Myrtle described, while unfortunate and gravely insulting, wasn't really very suspicious, when Pansy spoke up. Yes, well done, Myrtle, she said calmly. A student in your bathroom alone while there's a curfew in effect is indeed very suspicious. Oh. Right. Myrtle preened, isn't it though? Why would anyone throw a book at an innocent ghost if they weren't up to no good? Good point, Rigel said gravely. Thank you for reporting this, Myrtle. I'll mail order a Weird Sister poster this afternoon. Draco suppressed an amused grin with difficulty. Myrtle still hovered expectantly. Was there anything else, Myrtle? Pansy asked kindly. You haven't told me when you'll be coming by to get it. Feeling particularly slow, Rigel said, get what? Myrtle pouted, the book. You aren't just going to leave it there, of course. It's right in the middle of my toilet. Taking up space, reminding me of that awful girl and giving me flashbacks of all the trauma I underwent. I want it gone. She let out a frustrated noise, but I can't touch it. I've already tried to make the toilet explode, because sometimes when I'm really upset the water starts churning, but all it did was flood a bit. I suppose, Peeves would probably help if I told him it was to explode something. I'm sure that won't be necessary, Pansy said. Of course Rigel will get it out of the girls' bathroom, Draco said dryly, while we're under curfew. Excellent plan. I'll get it then, Pansy said confidently. She stood and brushed at her skirts. You. Now. Draco said incredulously. I'll be back before you know it, Pansy said, a bit dryly. Wait, Rigel said, frowning, it isn't safe. I'll take a prefect, Pansy said, and besides, I'm a Slytherin. I'll be fine. She set off across the lawn toward where the upper-year Slytherins were sitting without looking back. -0. PPPPPP. -0. By the time Pansy reached the 6th years, she was wearing her third favorite expression. She didn't have a name for this one yet, but it was one part earnest, one part mildly helpless, and one part embarrassed. She made her eyes slightly wider than normal, bit her lip ever so slightly at the corner, and made her brow perfectly smooth, too smooth, as though she were concentrating very hard on not letting her forehead crinkle with discontent. She tapped the 6th-year male prefect for her house on his upper arm, as though she could not quite reach up to his shoulder. It was a firm enough tap that she only had to do it once, but soft enough to be almost apologetic in itself. He turned, and raised an eyebrow. Yes. Pansy hesitated just long enough to make a point, flicking her eyes at the prefect's friends. The prefect, whose name she thought started with an F and reminded her of a lawyer for some reason, gave his friends a quick nod and moved off to the side to grant her a more private conversation. Thank you, Pansy said at once. I'm sorry to inconvenience you, but I presently require the use of a restroom. Would you mind accompanying me? The prefect looked uncomfortable for a moment before covering it with a polite tilt of his head. Selwyn may be more suited to that sort of errand. Pansy nodded, a bit shyly for effect. She just looks so content over there with Rookwood. I was loath to interrupt her, but if you think it's best. The prefect shot a look toward the head girl, who was indeed looking rather amicably engaged with Edmund at the moment. He grimaced slightly, probably at the thought of pulling Alice away from her. Unofficial, but who did they think they were fooling? Bo. Right then. I'll accompany you up to the entrance hall. Pansy affected a vaguely distraught expression, this time allowing her brow to crease a tiny bit. You haven't heard. Peeves was in some kind of snit earlier. Well, suffice to say the girls' bathrooms on the first floor suffered undue injury. I'm afraid the nearest usable one is on the second floor. She broke off, blinked worriedly up at him, and said in a rush, is that too far? If it's too much trouble, I can. I mean, I'm sure I could. She put on a very brave face. Wait. The prefect looked distinctly discomfited, but said, don't be silly. I wouldn't dream of making you wait. I'll inform one of the other prefects so they know we're gone. Just wait here a moment. Pansy smiled sweetly, the way she always did when things were going particularly according to plan. She glanced over at her boys to see them frowning worriedly in her direction. Something softened inside of her at their obvious concern. Some would say that every part of her was already soft. Pansy knew how she came across, soft-hearted and soft-headed, and she encouraged that impression painstakingly. When she was younger, her personality had been sharper, honest to a fault, and more like Daphne Greengrass than she cared to admit. She also had a grand total of 0 friends, unless you counted the unicorns who briefly made their home on her family's estate. Still, friendless as she was also unapologetic. She said what she thought and thought for herself, and her father especially was all too quick to encourage it. When Pansy turned 7, her mother tried to arrange a tea party with some of the other women in the Dark Daughters Society. None of the other women's daughters wanted to come. Pansy told herself she didn't care about those dumb girls with their simpering little faces and dull, glassy eyes, but her mother saw the blow done to her child's pride, and gave her a piece of sound advice. Be true to your beliefs and principles, she said, but don't push your peers away just because you can. You'd be surprised how far a smile can go. Pansy had taken her words to heart, and then taken them further and put her mind to work on them. She realized that thinking for yourself didn't always mean saying what you thought out loud. She practiced for hours in the mirror, came up with all sorts of kind, meaningless things she could say to people, and, amazingly and almost disappointingly, it worked. As it turned out, the whole world opened up when you were nice to people. So she made friends easily after that. Everyone loved the pretty, sweet blonde girl with wide eyes and a kind smile, especially when she let a ray of her intellect shine through every now and then, just to keep their interest. With her mind challenged by the new game and her social life much improved, though, a small part of her soul, the slippery, silvery part that laughingly reflected people's best expectations back at them for fun, couldn't help but wonder how other people could be so easily won. Really, where was the fun in adoration if it was obtained so easily? So she had lived, content to gather friends like butterflies in a net of smiles, and then she had met someone different. A small, dark-haired boy with wide eyes and an embarrassingly slack expression walked into the great hall next to her, and she found she couldn't quite stop the blunt assessment that passed her lips. She'd immediately smiled, in an automatic attempt to temper her opinion, but the boy didn't seem to take any offense at her words. On the contrary, he smiled back. It was one of the most perfect fake smiles she'd ever seen, and it felt, in that instant, as though fate had been appraised of her growing ennui and responded in the most expedient way it could manage, with a kindred spirit. That was how Pansy became friends with the enigma Rigel Black, and through the ordeal that was becoming Rigel's friend, became Draco Malfoy's companion as well. The odd thing about Rigel was, even though his surface was as porcelain as her own, he didn't seem to realize how alike they were. She suspected he was very good at playing pretend, but not very good at recognizing other players on the pitch. Not that it mattered. Sometimes, Pansy thought the mask was all that really mattered. Who was a person, really, if not the sum of their actions and the impressions they left on other people? What was a soul, when compared with that? The prefect returned quickly, and accompanied Pansy dutifully to the second floor. Pansy could admit she was curious as to what Myrtle had kicked up such a fuss about. With luck, the book would be something interesting, like a secret notebook shared between friends. She could picture it now, one friend getting angry and disposing of the book out of spite. Or perhaps the book contained love letters from a boy who had broken the girl's heart. With any luck, it might even be a diary. -0. NF. -0. End of part 3.